The story of the Yamato people begins in the deep layers of Japan's prehistoric past, where shifting patterns of settlement and subsistence slowly formed the foundation for what would later become the earliest political centres in the archipelago. Archaeological remains scattered across the islands provide glimpses of these beginnings, showing communities adapting to a unique landscape shaped by mountains, rivers, and coastal plains. In the Jomon period, which extended from around 14,000 BCE to 300 BCE, the inhabitants lived as skilled foragers, hunters and fishers. They created pottery with cord-mark designs, among the oldest in the world, and left behind pit dwellings that reveal a communal way of life. Their world was not yet structured by centralised political power, but by localised communities bound together by ritual and subsistence needs. The legacy of the Jomon was long-lasting, for even as later arrivals reshaped the social fabric, elements of Jomon spirituality and interaction with the natural world continued to inform the culture that grew in Yamato lands. Around the final centuries of the Jomon period, the islands witnessed profound changes as new waves of people and practices spread from the continent. This transition is known as the Yayoi period, beginning around 300 BCE and lasting until roughly 300 CE. Rice agriculture, wet field irrigation, bronze weapons and iron tools all entered the archipelago, marking a dramatic departure from earlier lifeways. The introduction of wet rice cultivation in particular altered patterns of settlement and labour, binding communities more closely together around shared fields and harvest cycles. Archaeological evidence from northern Kyushu shows how these technologies first appeared through contacts with the Korean peninsula, gradually moving eastward and transforming regions such as the Kinai Plain, where the Yamato heartland would later emerge. The population increased substantially, reflecting the ability of agriculture to support larger communities, and with growth came more complex social hierarchies. Burial mounds from this period, often containing bronze mirrors and weapons, reveal a society increasingly defined by status distinctions, where elite families mark their power in both ritual and material display. The Yamato name itself comes into focus during the final stages of the Yayoi and into the succeeding Kofun period. Large keyhole-shaped burial mounds, known as kofun, dominate the landscape of this era, signalling the emergence of powerful lineages that could mobilize labour on an unprecedented scale. These mounds were concentrated in the Nara basin, an area surrounded by mountains and fertile plains that would become synonymous with the Yamato polity. The monumental scale of these kofun indicates not only wealth, but political authority, as building such structures required the coordination of thousands of workers, artisans and retainers. The centralization implied by these projects suggests that the Yamato elite were beginning to consolidate power over surrounding clans, establishing a system of alliances and subordination that laid the groundwork for Japan's earlier state. Chinese historical texts, particularly the records of the Wei from the 3rd century CE, mention emissaries from the Wa people, as they called the inhabitants of the islands, describing them as ruled by a queen known as Himiko, who maintained authority through ritual and diplomacy. While scholars debate the direct association of Himiko with Yamato, these records confirm that societies in the archipelago were already developing centralized leadership capable of engaging with continental powers. The geography of the Yamato region contributed significantly to its rise. The Nara basin provided fertile land for rice cultivation, surrounded by natural barriers that offered protection while still allowing access to trade routes leading to the inland sea and beyond. Rivers facilitated irrigation and transport, linking communities within the basin and creating a cohesive economic unit. The natural environment thus reinforced the capacity of early Yamato leaders to accumulate surplus resources and direct them toward political projects. The association of this land with sacred origins further elevated its significance. Later chronicles, such as the Kojiki and Nihon Shoki, would describe Yamato as the divine homeland where the descendants of the sun goddess Amaterasu established rule, intertwining geography with mythology in a way that anchored political legitimacy in the physical and spiritual landscape. These narratives, though compiled centuries later, reflect the enduring association of the Yamato plane with both the practical basis of power and the sacred mandate to rule. The early Yamato people lived at the intersection of myth and history, where oral traditions of divine descent merged with the realities of clan alliances and agricultural production. Clans known as uji formed the primary units of social and political organisation, each headed by a patriarchal leader who held both secular and ritual authority. The most powerful among them claimed descent from deities, using genealogical myths to assert their superiority and justify their leadership roles. Within this framework, the Yamato lineage distinguished itself by claiming direct descent from the sun goddess, a narrative that positioned them not simply as one clan among many, but as uniquely entitled to supreme authority. This divine genealogy provided a unifying ideology that allowed the Yamato rulers to gather support from subordinate clans who recognized their own status within a hierarchy that reflected cosmic order. Religious practice played a central role in these early communities. The worship of kami, divine beings associated with natural phenomena and ancestral spirits, structured rituals that bound clans together. The Yamato rulers assumed the role of chief priests as well as political leaders, overseeing ceremonies that ensured agricultural fertility, protection from natural disasters, and harmony between the human and divine realms. This integration of ritual and governance blurred the line between sacred and secular authority, reinforcing the perception that Yamato leadership was ordained by higher powers. Archaeological evidence of ritual sites, including offerings at rivers and shrines dedicated to mountain deities, illustrates the deep interconnection between spiritual life and the environment. The emergence of grand shrines in later centuries, such as Ise dedicated to Amaterasu, can be traced back to these formative practices where the legitimacy of leadership was inseparable from the ability to mediate between people and the divine. Interactions with neighbouring regions accelerated the development of Yamato society. Trade networks connected the islands with the Korean peninsula and China, bringing not only material goods such as bronze mirrors, swords, and silk, but also ideas about governance, writing, and religion. Chinese historical records note repeated embassies from the Double War, indicating that Yamato rulers actively sought recognition and alliances with powerful continental states. Such exchanges introduced concepts of bureaucratic administration and codified law, though initially adapted to the clan-based system of Japan. The possession of Chinese bronze mirrors became a symbol of legitimacy, often buried with Yamato elites as markers of their authority. These mirrors, some bearing inscriptions linking them to the Chinese courts, represented tangible connections between Yamato leaders and the broader East Asian world, reinforcing their claims to supremacy over other clans within the archipelago. The process of consolidation was not without conflict. The early Yamato polity faced challenges from rival clans who also sought to expand their power. Warfare during this era was conducted with iron weapons, armour and horse-riding techniques imported from the continent, transforming the scale and intensity of battles. Victory in these struggles required both military strength and diplomatic skill, as Yamato rulers had to secure alliances with regional powers while suppressing opposition. The construction of increasingly massive kofun during the 4th and 5th centuries illustrates both the success of Yamato rulers in consolidating control and the competitive display of their dominance. These burial mounds, some over 400 metres long, stood as enduring monuments to their power, visible reminders to all who lived in their shadow that authority rested firmly in Yamato hands. Yet the authority of Yamato rulers was never absolute. It depended on a delicate balance of alliances with subordinate clans, who retained autonomy in their local domains while acknowledging the supremacy of the Yamato court. This system required constant negotiation, gift exchange, and ritual affirmation to maintain cohesion. The institution of bei, occupational groups that serve specific functions such as metalworking, weaving, or ritual performance reflected the integration of economic and social roles into the political framework. By directing the labour of these groups, Yamato rulers extended their influence into the daily lives of their subjects, ensuring that the production of essential goods reinforced the structures of power. At the same time, the hierarchical nature of these relationships meant that discontent could easily fracture the unity of the polity if not carefully managed. As centuries passed, the image of the Yamato people solidified into one of continuity and divine mandate, but beneath the surface lay the realities of adaptation, negotiation, and transformation. The Yamato were not an isolated or static community, but a dynamic society shaped by exchanges with neighbouring cultures, internal struggles for power, and the demands of managing a growing population dependent on agriculture and ritual stability. The Yamato Plain became the crucible where these forces converged, producing a society capable of projecting authority across the Japanese archipelago. The legacy of this formative era would continue to echo in the centuries that followed, as new influences arrived from the continent, and as the Yamato rulers sought to transform their loose federation of clans into a centralized state. The roots of Yamato identity lie as much in these early adaptations as in the myths of divine descent. The archaeological record, Chinese chronicles, and later Japanese texts together weave a picture of a people gradually consolidating political and spiritual authority in a landscape that encouraged both cooperation and competition. Their rise was neither sudden nor inevitable, but the result of centuries of gradual change, where each new development built upon the foundations of the past. From the cord-marked pottery of the Jomon to the keyhole tombs of the Kofun, from clan rituals to continental diplomacy, the story of the Yamato people began with the interplay of environment, culture, and belief, setting the stage for the more complex transformations that would follow when new religious and political ideas entered the archipelago and reshaped the very nature of authority. The transformation from the Jomon way of life to the new cultural patterns of the Yayoi period marks one of the most profound shifts in the history of the Japanese archipelago, a transition that not only altered the material conditions of survival, but also laid the groundwork for the emergence of stratified communities and eventually political centralization. For thousands of years, the Jomon people had thrived as foragers, fishers, and hunters, adapting with remarkable resilience to diverse landscapes ranging from northern Hokkaido to the subtropical islands of Kyushu. Their pit dwellings clustered around lake shores and river valleys, their cord-marked pottery decorated with intricate designs, and their ritual sites filled with clay figurines all speak to a society deeply embedded in the rhythms of nature. Yet as new technologies, crops, and ideas filtered into the islands from the continent, a gradual reorientation began that reshaped every aspect of their existence. The introduction of wet rice agriculture was the single most decisive factor in this transformation. Archaeological evidence points to the northern Kyushu region as the entry point for rice cultivation, brought by migrants or traders from the Korean peninsula around the beginning of the first millennium BCE. The cultivation of rice in irrigated paddies differed fundamentally from the foraging and shifting horticulture that had sustained the Jomon. It required not only new tools and techniques, but also coordinated labour to manage water systems, plant cycles, and harvests. This collective aspect of agriculture fostered stronger bonds between households, as survival now depended on cooperative management of irrigation channels and shared fields. Over time, rice cultivation spread eastward, reaching the Kenai region by the later centuries of the first millennium BCE, where it became the foundation of the agricultural economy that would support the rise of the Yamato. The significance of rice extended far beyond mere sustenance. Unlike nuts, tubers, or wild plants gathered in earlier times, rice provided a stable and storable surplus that could sustain larger populations and support specialized labor. Communities could now accumulate resources, redistribute them in ritual or political contexts, and use them to support leaders or elites who claimed authority. The granaries that appear in the archaeological record of the Yayoi period symbolize this new economic reality, standing as both practical storage facilities and visible markers of power. Control over surplus meant control over people, and those who directed agricultural production gained new influence in their communities. This dynamic would, in time, give rise to the powerful clans that defined the Yamato order. Alongside agriculture, new materials and technologies accompanied the Yayoi transition. The arrival of metal tools and weapons, particularly bronze and iron, dramatically altered both daily life and social relations. Iron implements improved efficiency in farming, enabling the clearing of land, construction of irrigation works, and production of agricultural tools with durability far surpassing stone predecessors. Bronze, though less practical for farming, carried immense symbolic and ritual value. Mirrors, bells, and weapons crafted from bronze became central to ceremonial life, signifying status and connection to broader cultural networks. The possession of these objects marked out leaders and ritual specialists, embedding inequality more firmly into the structure of society. Excavations have revealed caches of bronze weapons buried in ceremonial contexts, suggesting that they were not merely tools of war but also emblems of legitimacy and spiritual authority. Population growth accompanied these changes, as the stable food supply supported higher densities of settlement. Villages expanded with longhouses and storage facilities clustered together in organised layouts. Defensive structures, such as moats or palisades, also appear in some sites, reflecting competition for resources and the need to protect growing communities. This era witnessed the beginnings of conflict on a new scale, as control over rice fields and access to fertile land became sources of tension. The evidence of violence found in skeletal remains, including arrow wounds and fractured bones, illustrates the reality of these struggles. Warfare in this context was not yet the large-scale, organised conflict of later centuries, but it foreshadowed the importance of military power in shaping the balance of political authority. Religious and ritual practices also adapted to the new agricultural order. Where the Jomon had emphasised animistic connections with forests, animals, and natural cycles, the Yayoi placed greater emphasis on fertility rituals, agricultural ceremonies, and the veneration of deities associated with rice cultivation. The cycle of planting and harvest structured the religious calendar, and leaders assumed roles as mediators with the divine to ensure prosperity. Archaeological finds of bronze bells, known as dotaku, suggest their use in rituals related to agriculture. Decorated with images of animals, plants, and geometric patterns, these bells were buried on hilltops or near settlements, perhaps to summon divine favour or to mark sacred spaces tied to the cultivation of rice. The integration of ritual with agricultural practice reinforced the authority of those who conducted ceremonies, further intertwining spiritual leadership with political power. The social organisation of the Yayoi communities reflects increasing complexity compared to their Jomon predecessors. Grave goods from burial sites provide clear evidence of stratification, with some individuals interred with bronze mirrors, iron weapons and ornaments, while others received only simple pottery or no grave goods at all. This differentiation indicates the rise of hereditary elites, families who pass down both wealth and ritual authority through generations. The construction of larger and more elaborate tombs for such individuals underscored their elevated status, while ordinary people lived in more modest dwellings and left behind fewer material traces. Over time, these disparities widened, creating the conditions for the emergence of centralized leadership that could extend beyond single villages to encompass broader regions. Connections with the continent remained vital throughout this period. The Korean peninsula acted as both a conduit and a partner in the exchange of goods, technologies, and ideas. Pottery styles show similarities across the straits, and imported objects such as bronze mirrors or continental-style weapons appear in Japanese contexts. These exchanges were not one-sided. Japanese products such as pearls, shells, and other local resources likely travelled back to Korea and China. Diplomatic and trade relationships also introduced new models of governance, as Yamato leaders encountered states and polities on the continent that operated with more formalised structures of power. While the Yayoi did not yet replicate these systems fully, the exposure laid the foundation for later adoption of bureaucratic practices and state institutions. The shift from foraging to farming did not occur uniformly across the archipelago. Some regions, particularly in the north, retained Jomon lifeways far longer, blending them with selective adoption of agricultural techniques. In other areas, such as Kyushu and the Kinai, the transition was more rapid and complete, driven by intensive contact with the continent and favourable environmental conditions. This unevenness underscores the diversity of experiences during the Yayoi era and the gradual nature of cultural transformation. The persistence of Jomon elements, such as continued use of certain pottery styles or ritual figurines, demonstrates that the new was not simply imposed over the old, but emerged through processes of adaptation, synthesis, and negotiation. The cultural memory of Jomon practices would remain embedded in Japanese identity long after the rise of agriculture, surfacing in rituals, aesthetics, and spiritual conceptions that endured into the historical period. The introduction of horses during the Yayoi also marked a significant change, though their role expanded more fully in later centuries. Initially associated with continental elites, horses were valued both for transportation and as symbols of prestige. Their presence in burial sites indicates the growing connections between warfare, mobility, and status. Mounted warriors, equipped with iron weapons and armour, became increasingly important in local conflicts, setting the stage for the martial traditions that would later dominate Japanese society. These developments reinforced the stratification of society, as only elites could maintain the resources necessary to own and equip horses and warriors, further consolidating their control. The architectural landscape of Yayoi settlements reflects the broader transformation of society. Raised floor buildings designed for storing grain became prominent features, their elevation protecting rice from moisture and pests, while symbolising the community's collective wealth. Residences of elites were often larger and more centrally located, while commoners lived in smaller structures at the periphery. The presence of defensive ditches or palisades around some settlements suggests both external threats and internal competition, as communities sought to protect their surpluses. The organisation of space within villages thus mirrored the social hierarchy, with storage facilities and elite residences dominating the centre, and ordinary dwellings radiating outward in patterns that revealed the growing divisions of wealth and status. The spread of rice agriculture also influenced dietary practices and health. While rice provided reliable calories, its dominance in the diet led to changes in nutrition, sometimes resulting in deficiencies compared to the more varied diet of the Jomon period. Skeletal remains from the Yayoi show increases in indicators of disease and malnutrition, reflecting the costs of reliance on a single staple crop. Yet despite these challenges, the advantages of agricultural surplus, population growth, and social organisation outweighed the drawbacks, ensuring the persistence and expansion of the new system. The shift in diet and health underscores the broader reality that cultural transitions are never purely beneficial or detrimental, but involve trade-offs that reshape human lives in complex ways. The memory of the Jomon persisted in stories, artifacts and practices that survived into later centuries. Pottery styles influenced Yayoi designs, and elements of animistic spirituality continued to inform beliefs about the natural world. Even as agriculture and metallurgy redefined society, the legacy of the foragers who had inhabited the islands for millennia was not entirely erased. Instead, the past and the present intertwined, with the new order building upon the foundations of the old. The Yamato, who would later emerge from these transformations, carried forward this blended heritage, their identity shaped by both the resilience of the Jomon and the innovations of the Yayoi. By the close of the Yayoi period, the Japanese archipelago had been irrevocably transformed. The rise of agriculture, metallurgy, social stratification, and external connections had created the conditions necessary for the emergence of centralized polities. Villages had grown into chiefdoms, elites had consolidated control through ritual and warfare, and the foundations of Yamato power were being laid in the fertile plains of the Kinai. The story of the Yamato cannot be understood without this critical transition, for it was in the shift from foraging to farming, from stone to metal, from equality to hierarchy, that the structures of authority first took root. The gradual blending of Jomon heritage with Yayoi innovation produced a culture capable of sustaining not only larger populations, but also the ideological and material systems of rule that would define the centuries to come. The rhythms of rice cultivation, the rituals of fertility, the construction of storage granaries, and the forging of iron weapons all signalled the dawn of a new era, one in which the Yamato people would find their place at the centre of an unfolding history that bound together myth, ritual, and political power in ways that would endure for generations. The growing presence of rice fields across the archipelago created a foundation upon which new forms of leadership emerged, and it is in this context that the earliest clans began to consolidate themselves into recognisable political units. What had once been loosely organised communities of farmers, hunters, and ritual specialists became increasingly stratified, with certain families rising above others to claim authority. These clans, known in later terminology as uji, represented not only bloodlines but also social and ritual organisations that combined practical governance with sacred responsibility. Their appearance marks a decisive stage in the transformation from village societies into larger chiefdoms capable of directing labour, mobilising warriors, and projecting authority across regions. The uji system was anchored in kinship but extended beyond mere family ties. At its core was the claim to descent from a common ancestor, often imagined as a deity or a legendary figure, which provided both a mythological foundation and a unifying ideology. These genealogical claims were not only stories but political tools, for they allowed leaders to present themselves as custodians of divine favour and mediators between the human and spiritual worlds. Within the uji, leadership rested with a patriarchal head known as the uji no kami, who exercised authority over both secular matters such as land distribution and ritual functions tied to the worship of ancestral kami. The dual nature of this role gave the clan leader a sacred legitimacy that reinforced his position above ordinary members. As rice cultivation deepened its hold on society, the ability to organise collective labour for irrigation and harvest became the critical measure of authority. Clans that successfully coordinated these tasks gained not only material resources, but also the loyalty of those who depended upon them. This process generated hierarchies within and among clans, as some extended their influence over neighbouring groups. Burial evidence from the late Yayoi and early Kofun periods shows clear differentiation between elites and commoners, with leaders interred in larger tombs accompanied by bronze mirrors, weapons and ornaments that symbolise their elevated rank. These displays were not simply personal, but statements to the living community, reminding all of the enduring power and prestige of the lineage. The rise of clans also introduced new forms of social specialisation. Certain groups became associated with particular crafts or ritual functions, forming occupational lineages that supported the broader structure of society. Metal workers, weavers, and ritual performers attached themselves to powerful clans, offering their services in exchange for protection and patronage. These occupational groups, known as bi in later centuries, reflected the integration of economy and hierarchy, as elites relied on specialised labour to enhance their prestige and maintain their households. In this way, the clan was not merely a family unit, but a political, economic, and religious organism encompassing diverse roles within a single structure of authority. Competition among clans was inevitable, as each sought to expand its control over land, labour, and resources. The fertile plains were particularly contested, with access to arable land and irrigation systems serving as the foundation for political power. Archaeological remains of moated villages suggest a climate of insecurity, where communities fortified themselves against rivals. Warfare during this era was both a practical and symbolic activity. Victories brought territory and resources, but they also enhanced the prestige of leaders, demonstrating their favour with the gods and their capacity to protect their followers. The accumulation of bronze and iron weapons in burial sites underlines the martial dimension of authority, where the ability to command warriors was as important as the capacity to oversee harvests. Chinese historical records provide valuable glimpses into the political landscape of the Japanese archipelago during this time. The records of the Wei, compiled in the 3rd century, describe the land of Wa and mention numerous small states, each with its own ruler. The most famous figure in these accounts is Queen Himiko, who is said to have governed through ritual and divination, maintaining peace and order by virtue of her spiritual authority. While scholars debate her precise identity and whether she ruled from Yamato, which some associate with the Yamato region, her presence in the record indicates the emergence of leaders whose power extended beyond simple clan authority to encompass entire regions. The Chinese sources also describe embassies sent from Jasawei, showing that these early chiefdoms were already engaging in diplomacy with the powerful states of the continent, seeking recognition and prestige that reinforced their domestic authority. The rise of chiefdoms reflects the gradual shift from localized clan organization to more centralized forms of political control. As some clans accumulated greater resources and followers, they extended their influence over others, creating federations bound together by alliances, marriages, and ritual obligations. These federations were fragile, often dependent on the personal authority of a strong leader, but they marked an important step toward the formation of more durable polities. The practice of marriage alliances among clans illustrates how political bonds were reinforced through kinship ties, ensuring loyalty and cooperation across broader territories. Ritual played an equally crucial role, as ceremonies involving multiple clans created opportunities for collective affirmation of shared cosmologies and hierarchies. The emergence of Kafun, the monumental keyhole-shaped burial mounds that characterize the period from the 3rd to the 7th centuries, provides striking material evidence of these transformations. The scale of these tombs, some measuring hundreds of meters in length, required enormous labour to construct, far beyond the capacity of a single village. Their presence indicates the ability of leaders to mobilise vast numbers of workers from subordinate clans, a clear sign of centralised authority. The objects buried within, including bronze mirrors imported from China, iron swords, and symbolic ornaments, testify to the wealth and connections of these elites. The Kofun themselves became symbols of political order, visible across the landscape as enduring reminders of the power of those interred within. The symbolic dimension of leadership grew increasingly important in this era. Chiefs did not rule solely through force. They also needed to embody the sacred authority that justified their dominance. Rituals centered on agricultural fertility, protection from natural disasters, and communication with ancestral kami were essential to the legitimacy of leaders. In this sense, political authority and religious responsibility were inseparable. Chiefs acted as priests who ensured the harmony of the community with the divine, and their success in securing abundant harvests or victory in war was interpreted as evidence of divine favour. The integration of political and spiritual authority established patterns that would endure into the later Yamato state, where the emperor himself was regarded as the chief priest of the nation. As chiefdoms expanded, the networks of exchange that connected different regions grew more elaborate. Clans at the peripheries supplied resources such as iron, salt, or specialized crafts to the dominant centers, while elites in the core redistributed prestige goods like bronze mirrors or imported silks. This system of tribute and redistribution reinforced the hierarchy, as subordinate clans demonstrated loyalty by providing resources, and central leaders maintained authority by generously redistributing wealth at feasts and ceremonies. The exchange of goods was thus deeply embedded in the political and ritual fabric of society, not merely an economic transaction, but a reaffirmation of relationships of power and obligation. The structure of these chiefdoms was not static, and their boundaries were fluid, shifting with the fortunes of war, alliance, and ritual prestige. Leaders who failed to secure the loyalty of their followers or who suffered defeats in conflict could quickly see their authority dissolve, while others rose to prominence through victories, marriages, or displays of ritual power. This fluidity underscores the experimental nature of political organization in this period, as societies tested and adapted models of governance in response to changing circumstances. Over time, however, certain clans proved more durable than others, consolidating their influence across wider territories and setting the stage for the emergence of the Yamato as the dominant polity. The gradual transformation of clans into chiefdoms also reshaped the social identities of ordinary people. Where once identity had been tied primarily to local communities and households, individuals now found themselves defined by their membership in larger clan structures. Ritual obligations, military service, and agricultural labour were increasingly organised through the clan, binding individuals to their leaders in relationships of duty and dependence. The sense of belonging to a larger political and spiritual order helped to integrate diverse communities into cohesive units, though always with the risk of fragmentation should the central authority falter. The material culture of the period illustrates these dynamics in vivid detail. Pottery styles became more standardized within regions, reflecting the integration of communities under shared cultural frameworks. Decorative motifs on bronze bells and mirrors often depicted themes of agriculture, warfare, and cosmology, reinforcing the ideological underpinnings of authority. The placement of tombs and ritual sites in prominent locations tied landscapes to the power of particular clans, embedding political authority in the very geography of the land. These artifacts and structures collectively reveal a society in transition, moving from small-scale, localized organization toward more complex hierarchical forms that could sustain larger populations and broader networks of control. The rise of clans and chiefdoms did not occur in isolation from the wider East Asian world. The Japanese archipelago was part of a regional system of interaction that included the Korean peninsula and the Chinese states. Contact with these neighbours introduced new technologies, prestige goods, and models of political organisation that influenced the development of Yamato society. The presence of Chinese bronze mirrors in Japanese tombs, for example, not only testifies to trade, but also to the symbolic importance of continental recognition. To possess such objects was to demonstrate connection to the great civilizations of the mainland, enhancing the prestige of leaders and reinforcing their authority at home. In this way, foreign contact played a crucial role in shaping domestic political structures, as elites leveraged these relationships to strengthen their position within the competitive landscape of the archipelago. The process of clan consolidation and the emergence of chiefdoms laid the essential groundwork for the Yamato state. It established the basic patterns of kinship-based authority, the integration of political and ritual functions, the use of monumental architecture to symbolize power, and the networks of exchange that bound together diverse regions. These elements, tested and refined through generations of competition and cooperation, created the institutional and ideological framework upon which the Yamato rulers would later build. The transformation of society from villages to clans to chiefdoms was gradual, uneven, and often contested, but its trajectory points clearly toward the centralization that would eventually define Japan's earliest historical era. The Yamato would inherit these traditions, expand upon them, and reconfigure them into a system capable of enduring for centuries, but their roots remained firmly embedded in this formative period when clans first rose to prominence and the outlines of political order began to take shape. The basin of Yamato, later known as Nara, was more than simply a convenient location for agriculture and settlement. It was a land that seemed to embody both natural abundance and spiritual significance, a place where geography itself appeared to reinforce the authority of those who chose it as their centre. Encircled by mountains, watered by rivers, and dotted with fertile plains, the Yamato region offered both the practical foundation of rice agriculture and the symbolic qualities of a sacred heartland. From early times, the clans who rose in prominence within this basin not only managed its resources but also framed its landscapes within a cosmological order, presenting the land as the divinely chosen site for human rule. The fusion of geography and mythology gave Yamato a unique place in the unfolding history of Japan, setting it apart as a realm where the earthly and the divine met in enduring ways. The geography of Yamato is striking in its natural design. The basin lies cradled by surrounding mountain ranges, the Ikoma Mountains to the west, the Katsuragi to the southwest, the Ki Range to the south, and the Yamato Highlands stretching eastward. These natural borders created both protection and definition, enclosing the basin in a way that fostered unity and distinct identity. At the same time, the rivers that flow through the basin, most notably the Yamato River and its tributaries, provided life-giving water for agriculture and transportation routes linking communities. The land within the basin was particularly fertile, ideal for rice cultivation, and this agricultural wealth allowed the early Yamato clans to sustain populations large enough to support ambitious political and ritual undertakings. Yet the significance of Yamato cannot be reduced to its physical characteristics alone. The very shape and arrangement of its landscape invited mythological interpretation. Mountains were not seen as inert masses of stone, but as sacred abodes of deities, rivers as living forces with divine spirits, and the fertile plains as gifts of abundance bestowed by heavenly ancestors. The people who lived in Yamato did not separate nature from the divine. The land itself was a theatre where the cosmic order revealed itself. By situating their authority within this sacred geography, the Yamato rulers claimed more than material control. They claimed to embody a mandate rooted in the natural and spiritual order of the universe. Later texts, such as the Kojiki and Nihon Shoki, compiled in the early 8th century, preserve the mythological traditions that anchored Yamato in a divine narrative. According to these chronicles, the Japanese islands themselves were created by the primordial deities Izanagi and Izanami, who stirred the chaos of the sea with a jewelled spear and allowed drops of brine to form the first landmass, Onogoro. From their union emerged further deities, including Amaterasu, the sun goddess whose brilliance illuminated the heavens. The myths placed the descendants of Amaterasu at the centre of human rule, with her grandson Ninigi sent down to earth to govern, carrying with him the sacred regalia of mirror, sword, and jewel. His great-grandson Jimmu is described as the first emperor, leading his people eastward to conquer Yamato, where he established the foundations of imperial rule. These myths, while compiled centuries after the events they describe, reflect the enduring perception of Yamato as the divinely chosen land. The basin where the emperors traced their ancestry to the gods was not arbitrary but sacred, the very place where the celestial mandate took form on earth. The association of the ruling lineage with Amaterasu reinforced this idea, for the sun goddess herself was said to have a special relationship with the land, her brilliance symbolizing the fertility of its fields and the protection of its people. The shrine of Is, dedicated to Amaterasu, became the central locus of this belief, a tangible embodiment of the connection between the divine ancestress and the earthly realm of Yamato. Mountains in the Yamato region carried particular significance as spiritual sites. Mount Miwa, located east of the basin, stands out as one of the earliest centers of Shinto worship. Unlike later shrines with buildings and sanctuaries, the worship of Mount Miwa took the mountain itself as the sacred object, embodying the presence of the deity Omononushi. Archaeological remains around the mountain indicate ritual activity from very early times, suggesting that Yamato leaders used its sanctity to legitimize their authority. By presenting themselves as the custodians of rituals directed to such deities, they wove their political control into the fabric of sacred geography. The mountain, visible from across the basin, became a constant reminder of the spiritual dimension underlying Yamato rule. The integration of mythology with geography served practical purposes as well. By framing their authority within a cosmic order, Yamato rulers could justify their dominance over rival clans. The claim to descent from Amaterasu placed them above others, while the location of their power in the sacred basin underscored their unique status. Rival clans might claim descent from other kami, but the Yamato lineage alone traced its origins to the sun goddess herself, the supreme deity of the pantheon. This divine ancestry was not simply a matter of belief, but a political ideology, one that helped secure alliances, inspire loyalty, and suppress dissent. The myths embedded in the land thus functioned as both spiritual narratives and tools of governance. The sacredness of Yamato was reinforced through rituals that tied the cycles of agriculture to cosmic order. Planting and harvest festivals, offerings at rivers and mountains, and ceremonies invoking fertility deities all linked the productivity of the land to divine favour. The role of the ruler was central in these rituals, for his performance of sacred duties was believed to ensure the prosperity of the fields and the well-being of the people. Failure to uphold ritual obligations could be interpreted as a loss of divine favour, leading to famine, disaster, or defeat in war. In this sense, the authority of Yamato leaders was inseparable from their ritual responsibilities, binding them to the land and its sacred rhythms. The myths recorded in the Kojiki and Nihon Shoki also emphasize the theme of conquest and unification. Jima's legendary eastward march into Yamato represents not merely the expansion of one clan, but the establishment of a universal order. The defeat of local rivals is framed as the triumph of divine mandate, legitimizing the supremacy of the Yamato lineage over other clans in the basin. This narrative functioned to retroactively validate the dominance of Yamato rulers, presenting their rise not as a contingent outcome of warfare and alliance, but as the fulfillment of destiny inscribed in the cosmic order. By rooting their authority in both myth and geography, the rulers of Yamato constructed a vision of leadership that transcended the mundane and anchored their political dominance in the very fabric of the universe. The sacred regalia of the imperial family, the mirror, sword, and jewel, symbolize this fusion of myth, geography, and authority. Each object carried profound meaning, the mirror representing Amaterasu and the clarity of divine truth, the sword embodying martial power and conquest, and the jewel symbolizing harmony and legitimacy. These regalia were said to have been handed down from the sun goddess to her descendants, and their possession became a defining feature of imperial authority. Their presence reinforced the notion that Yamato rule was not simply the result of human endeavour, but the expression of divine will manifest in sacred objects. These symbols tied the rulers not only to their mythological ancestors, but also to the sacred land where the regalia were preserved and venerated. Over time, the rituals associated with the sacred geography of Yamato grew more elaborate, integrating local traditions into a broader framework of Shinto belief. Shrines dedicated to kami of mountains, rivers, and fields proliferated, each reinforcing the sanctity of the landscape. Yamato rulers sponsored these shrines, asserting their role as the mediators between the people and the divine. In doing so, they extended their influence over both the physical and spiritual worlds, binding the loyalty of communities not only through political authority, but also through shared participation in sacred rituals. The land itself became a stage upon which the drama of legitimacy was continually reenacted, ensuring that the sacred geography of Yamato remained inseparable from the unfolding story of its people. This intertwining of geography and mythology shaped the very identity of the Yamato people. They were not simply inhabitants of a fertile basin, but participants in a divine narrative that placed their homeland at the centre of creation. The mountains, rivers, and plains of Yamato were imbued with sacred meaning, transforming everyday landscapes into reminders of cosmic order. The rituals that tied them to these landscapes reinforced a sense of belonging that was both local and transcendent, grounding identity in a geography that was at once earthly and divine. The Yamato people thus emerged not only as a political community, but as a sacred community, defined as much by their relationship to the land and its myths as by their allegiance to leaders. In later centuries, as the Yamato polity grew into an imperial state, the memory of this sacred geography continued to shape political and religious life. The imperial institution itself remained tied to the myth of descent from Amaterasu into the sacred sites of Yamato. Even as the capital shifted to other locations, the spiritual heart of the nation remained in the basin where the myths had placed its divine origins. The rituals performed there, the shrines that dotted its landscape, and the narratives that tied its geography to the creation of the world ensured that Yamato retained its status as the symbolic centre of Japan. The sacred land of Yamato was thus more than the cradle of the early political power. It was the enduring anchor of Japanese identity, a place where geography and mythology fused to create a foundation that would shape the destiny of a people for centuries to come. The spiritual foundations of the Yamato order rested upon a world view that saw the divine interwoven with every aspect of existence, a framework that would later be called Shinto, but which in its earliest forms represented the natural expression of reverence toward the kami, the spirits and deities that animated the world. In the fertile basin of Yamato and throughout the Japanese islands, mountains, rivers, forests, rocks, and ancestral lines were all understood as alive with presence. To live in such a world was to live in constant relation to powers both benevolent and dangerous, powers that required respect, ritual, and mediation. It was within this spiritual fabric that the Yamato lineage asserted itself, not as ordinary rulers but as the chosen descendants of the sun goddess Amaterasu, entrusted with the responsibility of harmonizing the human community with the divine order. The kami were not distant beings but immediate presences. They could inhabit the towering slopes of a mountain, the flowing waters of a stream, the rice fields upon which life depended, or the spirits of the dead whose memory lingered among the living. Each clan had its own tutelary deities, connected to their ancestral origins, and it was the responsibility of the clan head to ensure that proper rites were observed. This integration of spiritual and political leadership gave coherence to society, for ritual was not an optional act, but the very condition for prosperity and survival. The kami had to be placated, honoured and invoked, and only those with proper lineage and authority could conduct these rites effectively. The claim of the Yamato rulers to be direct descendants of Amaterasu thus elevated them above all others, positioning them as the supreme mediators between the people and the divine realm. The mythology of Amaterasu is preserved most fully in the 8th century chronicles, but its roots stretch deep into earlier traditions. She was depicted as the radiant goddess whose light illuminated the heavens, whose warmth ensured fertility, and whose authority structured the divine order itself. Her conflict with her unruly brother Susanoo, the storm god, provided one of the central dramas of the mythological cycle, a story that symbolized the tension between chaos and order, destruction and fertility. When Susanoo's violent actions desecrated Amaterasu's sacred weaving hall, she withdrew into a cave, plunging the world into darkness. The other gods, desperate to restore light, performed rituals and dances that coaxed her back into the world, restoring balance and life. This story, far from being a mere myth, reflected the fundamental concern of ritual life, the necessity of maintaining harmony with the forces that sustained existence, the danger of imbalance, and the power of ceremony to renew order. The descent of Amaterasu's grandson Ninigi from the heavens to rule the earth provided the mythological foundation for human governance. He was said to have brought with him the 3 sacred regalia, the mirror, the sword, and the jewel, symbols that embodied the essence of divine authority. The mirror represented clarity and truth, the ability to see and reflect the divine order. The sword symbolized strength and the capacity to protect and conquer. The jewel conveyed harmony, prosperity, and the legitimacy of rule. These regalia were not only mythological artifacts but central symbols of Yamato authority, preserved through centuries as tangible expressions of the divine mandate. Possession of these regalia became the defining attribute of the imperial family, anchoring their claim to rule in an unbroken lineage that reached back to the sun goddess herself. The first Emperor Jimmu was described as the great-grandson of Ninigi, and thus the direct descendant of Amaterasu. His legendary conquest of Yamato, recorded in the chronicles, was framed as the fulfillment of the divine plan, the establishment of human governance aligned with the cosmic order. By situating their ancestry in this mythological lineage, the Yamato rulers presented themselves not merely as successful warlords or clan leaders, but as the embodiment of divine will on earth. This narrative distinguished them from rival clans, for while many traced their origins to Kami, only the Yamato claimed descent from the supreme sun goddess whose brilliance encompassed all. The imperial line thus positioned itself as unique, eternal, and sacrosanct, a lineage whose legitimacy could not be contested without challenging the very order of the cosmos. The spiritual role of the Yamato rulers was expressed through their responsibility for ritual, particularly ceremonies tied to agriculture and fertility. As descendants of Amaterasu, they were entrusted with ensuring the fertility of the land, the success of the harvests, and the protection of the people. Rituals such as the first fruits offerings, where the ruler presented a portion of the harvest to the gods before consuming it himself, symbolized this mediating role. By performing such rites, the ruler renewed the covenant between heaven and earth, guaranteeing the prosperity of the people through the fulfillment of sacred obligations. The legitimacy of political authority thus rested as much on ritual performance as on military or administrative ability. Failure in ritual, interpreted as withdrawal of divine favour, could be catastrophic, for it would manifest in famine, disaster, or defeat, undermining the ruler's position. Shrines became the focal points of this spiritual system, each dedicated to particular kami and often tied to specific landscapes. Unlike later structures influenced by continental models, the earlier shrines were simple, emphasizing the natural presence of the kami rather than elaborate architecture. A sacred tree, a rock, or a mountain could serve as the object of worship, marked by ropes or enclosures to designate its sanctity. Over time, shrines such as Ise, dedicated to Amaterasu, grew into central institutions of Yamato religion. The Ise shrine in particular symbolized the intimate connection between the imperial family and their divine ancestress, its rituals conducted by imperial princesses who served as priestesses. The rebuilding of the shrine at regular intervals underscored the themes of renewal and continuity, ensuring that the divine presence remained perpetually alive within the sacred site. The worship of Amaterasu did not exclude the veneration of other kami. On the contrary, the pantheon was expansive, encompassing deities of storms, fertility, craftsmanship, and countless aspects of the natural and human world. What set Amaterasu apart was her position at the apex, her authority as the supreme deity whose descendants held rightful rule over the human realm. The imperial family's devotion to her did not diminish the role of other kami, but integrated them into a hierarchy that mirrored the political order. Just as subordinate clans owed loyalty to the Yamato rulers, so too did local deities acknowledge the supremacy of Amaterasu. This parallel between divine and human hierarchies reinforced the structure of authority, embedding political power within a cosmological framework that seemed natural and eternal. The rituals of Shinto were characterized by their emphasis on purity, renewal, and harmony with the natural world. Pollution, whether physical or spiritual, was believed to disrupt the balance between humans and kami, requiring purification through water, fire, or ritual acts. Festivals mark the cycles of planting and harvest, the changing of seasons, and the commemoration of ancestors. These ceremonies were not only religious observances but also occasions for communal gathering, reinforcing social bonds and affirming collective identity. By sponsoring and presiding over these rituals, the Yamato rulers ensured that their leadership was experienced not only in the realm of politics, but also in the intimate rhythms of daily and seasonal life. The ideological power of descent from Amaterasu proved remarkably durable. Even as the Yamato polity expanded, incorporated continental influences, and adapted to new circumstances, the claim of divine lineage remained central. It provided continuity across generations, allowing rulers to present themselves as part of an unbroken chain stretching back to the sun goddess. This continuity became a cornerstone of Japanese identity, distinguishing the imperial line as unique in the world for its uninterrupted descent from divine origins. In times of crisis, this lineage offered stability. In times of expansion, it offered legitimacy, whether in the struggles of early clan consolidation or the transformations of later state formation. The spiritual foundations of Yamato authority rested upon the enduring brilliance of Amaterasu and the sacred order she represented. The connection between Shinto foundations and Yamato political power reveals how deeply intertwined religion and governance were in this early period. To speak of one without the other is to miss the essence of the system. The Yamato rulers did not rule as mere kings, but as priestly figures whose authority flowed from the divine realm. Their political dominance was inseparable from their ritual responsibilities, and their legitimacy was expressed through ceremonies that tied the fate of the people to the will of the gods. This integration ensured that challenges to their rule could not easily be framed in secular terms, for to question their authority was to question the cosmic order itself. The mythology of Amaterasu and the practices of Shinto thus provided not only spiritual meaning, but also practical tools of governance, binding society together under a shared framework that combined the sacred and the political in one continuous whole. As the Yamato expanded their reach and incorporated new clans into their orbit, the narrative of divine lineage served as a unifying ideology. Subordinate clans could acknowledge their own ancestral deities while still recognizing the supremacy of Amaterasu and her descendants. This inclusive yet hierarchical system allowed for diversity within unity, accommodating local traditions while reinforcing the central authority of the imperial line. It was a flexible model, one that could adapt to changing circumstances without losing its core, and it proved vital in the centuries to come as the Yamato rulers faced challenges both internal and external. The sacred narrative of descent from the sun goddess remained the constant thread, weaving together the fabric of Yamato society across generations. The figure of Emperor Jimmu stands at the intersection of myth and history, a symbolic ancestor whose story anchors the Japanese imperial dynasty in the divine narrative of the sun goddess Amaterasu. While modern historians debate the historicity of Jimmu, his role within the Yamato tradition cannot be overstated, for he represents the embodiment of a people's understanding of their own beginnings. His conquest of Yamato, an establishment of rule, was remembered not as the achievement of a mere warrior, but as the fulfillment of a divine mission, a story crafted to legitimize the supremacy of the imperial line and to frame political authority within the cosmic order itself. Through Jimmu, the Yamato rulers projected their lineage back into a time beyond memory, presenting themselves as the heirs of a divine mandate that stretched from heaven to earth. The chronicles compiled in the 8th century, the Kojiki and Nihon Shoki, present Jimmu as the great-grandson of Ninigi, who descended from the heavens carrying the sacred regalia of mirror, sword and jewel. Ninigi's descent itself had been framed as the moment when heavenly rule was extended to the human realm, and Jimmu, born generations later, became the agent through which this heavenly inheritance was realized in the land of Yamato. His early life is described as beginning in Kyushu, from where he and his brothers set out on a great migration eastward. This movement from west to east mirrored both historical patterns of cultural transmission, for agriculture and metallurgy had entered Japan through Kyushu, and symbolic patterns of legitimacy, for the eastward journey culminated in the sacred heartland of Yamato, where the dynasty would take root. The journey of Jimmu was not presented as an ordinary migration, but as a divinely guided conquest. Along the way, he faced resistance from local chieftains and forces who opposed his advance, yet he prevailed not only through martial strength, but through the support of the gods. The chronicles emphasize that he was aided by divine interventions, such as the guidance of a sacred three-legged crow known as Yatagarasu, sent by the gods to lead him to victory. This motif of celestial assistance reinforced the perception that his conquest was not merely a matter of human ambition, but the unfolding of a divine plan. The battles he fought and the lands he subdued were remembered not as acts of domination, but as the establishment of rightful order, the imposition of harmony upon a fragmented landscape. The symbolic significance of Jimmu's eastward march lies also in its geographical and cosmological associations. Moving from Kyushu to Yamato symbolized the unification of disparate regions under a single authority, a process mirrored in later historical expansions of the Yamato state. The direction itself carried meaning, for the east was associated with the rising sun, the very symbol of Amaterasu, whose brilliance represented life, fertility, and legitimate rule. By marching eastward, Jimmu was not simply seeking new territory. He was moving toward the source of divine illumination, aligning his journey with the path of the sun, and thereby reaffirming his descent from the goddess. The conquest of Yamato thus became more than a story of migration. It was a cosmic act, the realization of a heavenly order within the earthly realm. When Jimmu finally entered the Yamato basin, his victory was portrayed as decisive and transformative. Local chieftains who had resisted were subdued, and the land was brought under his authority. It was in Yamato that he established his palace, marking the beginning of imperial rule. The act of enthronement itself carried profound ritual significance, for it represented the formal unification of heaven and earth through the person of the emperor. By taking his place as ruler in Yamato, Jimmu did not merely claim political dominance. He fulfilled the divine mission entrusted to him by his ancestors, binding the people to the cosmic order embodied in his lineage. The establishment of his rule was thus remembered as the birth of a dynasty, a moment when myth became the framework for history, and history was elevated into myth. The genealogical continuity claimed through Jimmu ensured that every subsequent emperor could trace his authority back to the sun goddess. This unbroken line, maintained through careful preservation of records and rituals, became the core of the imperial institution. While other clans could claim descent from Kami, none could rival the direct line from Amaterasu through Ninigi to Jimmu. This exclusivity distinguished the Yamato dynasty, granting it a legitimacy that transcended the fortunes of war or the fluctuations of power. Even in times when emperors wielded little practical control, the symbolic weight of their lineage maintained their authority, for it was rooted not in human achievement, but in divine descent. The story of Jimmu thus functioned not merely as a tale of origins, but as a perpetual source of legitimacy, invoked again and again across centuries to reinforce the sanctity of the throne. The rituals associated with Jimmu's legacy further embedded his significance in the cultural life of the Yamato people. Festivals commemorated his achievements, linking the agricultural cycles to the memory of his divine mission. His mausoleum, said to lie in Kashihara in the Yamato region, became a site of veneration, connecting the living community to the founder of the dynasty. Ceremonies conducted there were not only acts of remembrance but affirmations of continuity, ensuring that the people and their rulers remained bound to the origins of their political and spiritual order. By venerating Jimmu, the Yamato people reaffirmed their place within a lineage that reached back to the dawn of the world. Historians have long debated the historical reality behind the figure of Jimmu. Some see him as a composite memory of early migrations and conquests, a symbolic representation of the transition from Yayoi chiefdoms to the centralized Yamato polity. Others argue that his story was a later invention, crafted by the compilers of the chronicles to legitimize the imperial line by linking it to divine ancestry. Whatever the case, the importance of Jimmu lies not in whether he existed as an individual, but in how his story functioned within Yamato society. As a mythic ancestor, he provided a narrative of origin, a justification for rule, and a sacred framework that bound together people, land, and divine mandate. His presence in the chronicles gave coherence to the Yamato identity, situating the people within a cosmic history that began with the gods and continued unbroken through their descendants. The legendary conquest of Jimmu also reveals how mythology and politics worked hand in hand in the formation of early states. By framing their rise in terms of divine destiny, the Yamato rulers could present their authority as natural, inevitable, and eternal. Rival clans could be incorporated into this framework by acknowledging the supremacy of the imperial line, their own genealogies accommodated within a broader hierarchy that placed Amaterasu and her descendants at the top. This inclusiveness allowed for diversity within unity, binding together communities of different origins under a shared narrative of cosmic order. The myth of Jimmu thus provided the ideological foundation for the expansion of Yamato power, offering a story that could justify both conquest and cooperation. The story of Jimmu's dynasty resonated deeply with the people of Yamato because it linked their everyday existence to a grand cosmic narrative. The rice fields they cultivated were not merely economic resources but sacred gifts from the sun goddess, whose descendant ruled over them. The rituals they observed were not empty ceremonies, but essential acts that renewed the covenant between heaven and earth. The authority they recognized in their rulers was not simply political but spiritual, rooted in a lineage that transcended human history. In this way, the figure of Jimmu bridged the gap between myth and reality, giving meaning to the present by situating it within a sacred past. The endurance of this narrative across centuries speaks to its power. Even in later periods, when political authority shifted to warrior elites or military governments, the memory of Jimmu remained central to the legitimacy of the imperial institution. Shoguns might rule in practice, but emperors remained the symbolic axis of the realm, their lineage reaching back to Jimmu and through him to Amaterasu. This continuity ensured that the idea of Japan as a divine land, ruled by a sacred dynasty, persisted even in times of political upheaval. The story of Jimmu was thus not confined to the distant past, but remained an active force shaping identity and governance throughout Japanese history. The birth of the dynasty through Jimmu's conquest of Yamato represented more than the foundation of a ruling family. It symbolized the alignment of human society with the cosmic order. By tracing their ancestry to the sun goddess and situating their rule in the sacred basin of Yamato, the imperial line claimed a legitimacy that could not be challenged without undermining the very fabric of existence. The story of Jimmu offered a vision of history that was both mythic and practical, grounding authority in divine descent while also reflecting the realities of migration, conquest, and consolidation. It was this fusion of myth and history that gave the Yamato dynasty its enduring power, ensuring that its origins would be remembered not as the rise of a clan, but as the fulfillment of a cosmic destiny that continues to define Japanese identity to this day. The rise of the Yamato lineage to preeminence did not occur in a single stroke, nor was it secured merely by the mythic legacy of Jimmu. It was a gradual process of negotiation, conquest, alliance, and ritual, through which the rulers of the Yamato basin transformed themselves from one powerful clan among many into the dominant authority across much of the archipelago. Their claim to descent from the sun goddess Amaterasu gave them a potent ideological advantage, but the reality of power depended on their ability to build coalitions, defeat rivals, and manage the complex relationships that bound together the early clans. It was through this long and uneven process that the Yamato kings consolidated their rule, laying the institutional and ideological foundations of Japan's first state. The Yamato basin, with its fertile plains and natural defences, gave its leaders a secure base from which to expand. Rice cultivation supported dense populations, and the construction of monumental Kofun tombs testified to the labour and resources they could command. These great keyhole-shaped mounds, visible across the landscape, served both as resting places for rulers and as unmistakable declarations of power. Their sheer size required the cooperation of numerous communities, suggesting that Yamato kings had already succeeded in binding together a wide network of subordinate clans. The distribution of Kofun across central Japan further indicates the spread of Yamato influence, as local elites adopted the burial style to signal their connection to the central polity. In this way, architecture itself became an instrument of consolidation, unifying diverse regions through shared participation in the cult of monumental tombs. The political structure of the Yamato polity rested on the delicate balance of authority between the central rulers and the powerful clans that surrounded them. These clans retained significant autonomy in their own domains, but they acknowledged the supremacy of the Yamato kings, often through ritual obligations and participation in collective projects. The Uji system provided the framework, with each clan headed by a patriarch who traced descent from a deity and held both political and ritual authority. The Yamato rulers distinguished themselves within this system by claiming direct descent from Amaterasu, situating themselves at the apex of a hierarchy that encompassed all others. By incorporating rival clans into this order, often through marriage alliances and the granting of prestigious titles, they extended their control without entirely erasing local identities. Military power played a decisive role in this process. The Yamato kings were not merely ritual leaders, but warlords who commanded armies of mounted warriors armed with iron weapons. The adoption of horse-riding techniques from the continent gave them a significant advantage, allowing for rapid movement and the projection of force across wide territories. Conflicts with rival clans, particularly those in eastern Japan, were frequent, and victories were essential to maintaining legitimacy. The chronicles describe campaigns in which Yamato forces subdued rebellious leaders and expanded their domain, though these accounts were often framed in mythological terms to emphasize divine favor. Archaeological evidence of weapons, armor, and fortifications confirms that warfare was central to the consolidation of Yamato power, shaping the political landscape of the early state. Diplomacy was equally important. The Yamato rulers cultivated relationships with the powerful states of the Korean peninsula and China, seeking recognition and prestige that reinforced their authority at home. Chinese records from the 5th century refer to the rulers of Wa, describing them as kings who sent embassies to the Chinese court. These missions were not merely symbolic. They secured valuable gifts, such as bronze mirrors and titles, that enhanced the prestige of the Yamato kings. To be recognized by China was to be acknowledged as legitimate within the broader East Asian world, and this external validation translated into greater authority within the archipelago. The possession of Chinese mirrors, often buried in Kofun tombs, became a potent symbol of this connection, linking the rulers of Yamato to the great civilization across the sea. The integration of continental influences extended beyond diplomacy. New technologies, administrative practices, and cultural forms entered Japan through contact with Korea and China, gradually shaping the character of the Yamato polity. Iron tools and weapons transformed agriculture and warfare, while new styles of architecture and ritual enriched the cultural landscape. The introduction of writing, though limited in this early period, provided the foundation for record-keeping and communication that would later become essential to statecraft. These influences did not erase native traditions, but were selectively adopted and adapted, integrated into the framework of Yamato society in ways that reinforced the authority of the rulers. The Yamato kings positioned themselves as the conduits of these prestigious foreign connections, monopolizing access to continental goods and ideas to strengthen their dominance over rival clans. The ritual dimension of consolidation was no less significant. The Yamato rulers assumed the role of chief priests of the nation, conducting ceremonies that ensured the fertility of the land and the protection of the people. Their descent from Amaterasu gave them a unique claim to this role, for as her descendants they alone possessed the divine mandate to mediate between heaven and earth on behalf of the entire community. Major rituals, such as the offerings of first fruits and ceremonies dedicated to agricultural fertility, bound together clans from across the realm in collective affirmation of Yamato supremacy. By presiding over these rituals, the kings positioned themselves not merely as political leaders, but as essential mediators whose authority was inseparable from the prosperity of the land itself. The system of occupational groups, known as BE, further reinforced the authority of the central rulers. These groups were organised around specific functions: metalworking, weaving, ritual performance or military service, and were attached to powerful clans or to the royal household itself. By controlling the labour of these groups, the Yamato kings extended their influence into the daily lives of their subjects, ensuring that essential economic and ritual tasks were bound to the central polity. This system reflected the growing complexity of Yamato society, where specialization and hierarchy became increasingly prominent features. The integration of the Bi into the political order illustrates how consolidation depended not only on military and ritual authority, but also on the effective management of economic resources. The consolidation of Yamato power was not a straightforward or uncontested process. Rival clans resisted, and the balance of power shifted with the fortunes of war, alliance, and ritual prestige. Yet over time, the Yamato king succeeded in establishing themselves as the central authority, a position symbolized most dramatically by the scale of their coffin tombs. The largest of these, such as the tomb attributed to Emperor Nintoku, stretched over 400 meters in length, rivaling the great monuments of other ancient civilizations. Such structures could only be built through the mobilization of vast labor forces, demonstrating the ability of the Yamato rulers to command loyalty and resources on an unprecedented scale. The very landscape of central Japan was reshaped by these tombs, their presence reinforcing the permanence and inevitability of Yamato authority. As the Yamato polity expanded, it absorbed diverse regions and cultures, integrating them into a broader framework of authority. Local traditions were not erased but incorporated, their deities acknowledged within the hierarchy of kami under the supremacy of Amaterasu. This inclusive approach allowed the Yamato rulers to maintain unity while respecting regional diversity, a strategy that contributed to the stability of their rule. By recognizing the local identities of subordinate clans while situating them within a larger cosmic order, the Yamato kings created a flexible and resilient system capable of adapting to changing circumstances. The consolidation of Yamato power thus represents a critical stage in the formation of the Japanese state. It was a process that combined military strength, diplomatic skill, ritual authority, and economic management, all framed within the powerful mythology of divine descent. The Yamato rulers were not simply the most powerful warlords of their time, they were the embodiment of a sacred lineage that justified their supremacy and bound together a diverse and complex society. Their success in consolidating power laid the foundation for the later development of more formal institutions, such as codified laws and bureaucratic administration, but the essential framework of authority was already in place. The legacy of this period endured long after, for the patterns of hierarchy, ritual, and legitimacy established under the Yamato kings continued to shape Japanese political culture for centuries to come. The consolidation of power under the Yamato kings also marked the beginning of Japan's integration into the wider East Asian world as an identifiable polity. By sending embassies to China, adopting continental technologies, and positioning themselves as the representatives of divine authority, the Yamato rulers defined themselves both domestically and internationally. They were no longer merely one among many competing clans. They had become the central power of the archipelago, recognized abroad and revered at home. This dual identity, as both sacred descendants of the sun goddess and kings engaged in the politics of East Asia, gave the Yamato dynasty a unique position that would shape the course of Japanese history from its earliest beginnings. The consolidation of Yamato power at home coincided with the deepening of contacts abroad, for the Japanese islands were never isolated from the movements of people, goods and ideas that circulated across East Asia. From the earliest introduction of wet rice agriculture, metallurgy and horse riding techniques, the role of the Korean peninsula and China had been decisive in shaping the cultural trajectory of the archipelago. By the time the Yamato kings were building their great tombs and expanding their authority, these influences had become indispensable to the development of their society. The cultural, technological and political models provided by Korea and China offered not only practical benefits but also prestige, linking Yamato rulers to the great civilizations across the sea and reinforcing their legitimacy within the archipelago. To understand the early Yamato state is to recognize how profoundly it was shaped by these continental connections, which touched every aspect of life from agriculture and warfare to religion, governance, and identity. The Korean peninsula served as the immediate bridge between Japan and China, its own kingdoms, most notably Goguryeo, Baekje, and Silla, acting as both partners and rivals in the transmission of culture. Archaeological evidence shows the steady movement of technologies and styles, from Korea into Japan during the Yayoi and Kofun periods. Ironworking techniques in particular were transmitted through Korean intermediaries, allowing Yamato elites to equip their warriors with superior weapons and armor. The mastery of iron not only enhanced agricultural productivity, but also transformed warfare, giving the Yamato kings an advantage in their struggles against rival clans. The possession of iron swords and armor became symbols of elite status, displayed in burials as markers of prestige as much as tools of combat. Without the influence of Korea, the martial dimension of Yamato power would have been far less formidable. Equally significant was the introduction of horse culture. Horses themselves were brought to Japan from the continent, and with them came new forms of mobility and military organization. Mounted warriors became an increasingly important component of Yamato armies, their speed and striking power allowing for campaigns over greater distances. The image of the mounted warrior armed with iron weapons and clad in armor became emblematic of the emerging martial elite. This transformation of warfare paralleled developments in Korea and northern China, where cavalry played a central role in military power. By adopting these continental techniques, the Yamato rulers not only enhanced their own military effectiveness, but also aligned themselves with the standards of power recognized across East Asia. The flow of goods across the seas brought more than weapons. Prestige objects such as bronze mirrors, gilt ornaments, and fine pottery travelled from China through Korea into the hands of Yamato elites. These objects were not valued only for their beauty, but for the connections they represented. A bronze mirror bearing Chinese inscriptions was more than a polished surface. It was a tangible link to the great dynasties of the continent, proof that the ruler who possessed it had been acknowledged by the civilization at the heart of East Asia. Such objects were often buried in Kofun tombs, where they served as eternal symbols of the ruler's prestige and his connection to a wider world. The possession of continental goods thus became a central marker of status, reinforcing the hierarchy within Yamato society, while tying it to the networks of exchange that spanned the region. Diplomatic relations with China provided the Yamato rulers with an opportunity to transform these cultural connections into political capital. Chinese records from the 5th century, particularly the Book of Song, describe embassies sent from Wa, the Chinese term for Japan. These embassies requested recognition from the Chinese emperor, who in turn granted titles to the Yamato kings. Such recognition was highly prized, for it elevated the Yamato ruler above his domestic rivals by portraying him as the legitimate king of Wa in the eyes of the greatest power in East Asia. To be recognized by China was to be placed within the dynastic order, a hierarchy that extended prestige and legitimacy to those who acknowledged the supremacy of the Chinese emperor. For the Yamato rulers, this recognition was invaluable, reinforcing their authority at home and giving them an aura of international legitimacy. Relations with the Korean kingdoms were more complex, oscillating between alliance and conflict. Baekje, in particular, maintained close ties with the Yamato court, sending envoys, artisans, and scholars who introduced new technologies and ideas. The alliance with Baekje allowed Yamato rulers to participate more fully in the cultural and political networks of the continent, giving them access to goods and knowledge that might otherwise have been restricted. Silla and Goguryeo, by contrast, were often rivals, and conflicts over territory and influence on the peninsula drew Yamato into continental struggles. These interactions reveal that the Yamato polity was not a passive recipient of influence, but an active participant in the geopolitics of East Asia, pursuing alliances, waging war, and asserting itself within the shifting balance of power. Among the most transformative influences introduced from Korea and China was writing. The adoption of Chinese characters provided a tool for recording genealogies, rituals, and communications, though in these early centuries literacy was restricted to a small elite. Writing allowed the Yamato court to preserve its claims to divine descent and to articulate its authority in ways that oral tradition alone could not. It also facilitated diplomacy, enabling correspondence with continental courts in the recognized language of civilization. While the full integration of writing into governance would come later, its introduction marked a turning point in Yamato society, giving rulers a powerful instrument to formalize their authority and connect themselves to the broader cultural sphere of East Asia. Religion, too, was deeply shaped by continental influence. Buddhism, introduced from Korea in the 6th century, represented perhaps the most dramatic shift in Japanese religious life. While this introduction occurred slightly later than the early Yamato consolidation, the groundwork for its acceptance was laid through centuries of contact with Korea and China. The new faith brought with it not only spiritual teachings but also artistic forms, architectural styles, and models of governance infused with Buddhist cosmology. Temples, images of the Buddha, and ritual practices enriched the cultural landscape, offering new ways for rulers to legitimize their authority by presenting themselves as patrons of a universal faith. Although Buddhism would come to coexist with and transform native Shinto traditions, its arrival was possible only because of the deep channels of exchange that linked Yamato to the continent. The influence of Chinese models of governance also began to shape the Yamato polity. The idea of centralized administration, codified laws, and hierarchical bureaucracy was familiar to the great dynasties of China, and Yamato rulers selectively adopted aspects of these systems to strengthen their own authority. Titles granted to clan leaders, systems of tribute, and the organization of labor through occupational groups reflected this influence, even if adapted to local conditions. The Yamato court began to present itself not merely as a loose federation of clans, but as a state with a central ruler who commanded loyalty across diverse regions. This evolution was gradual, but the models provided by China offered a template for what a centralized polity could look like, a vision that the Yamato kings sought to emulate in their own way. Artistic and cultural forms also reveal the imprint of continental influence. Styles of pottery, jewellery, and clothing reflect patterns found in Korea and China, adapted to local tastes and materials. The art of metallurgy, transmitted from the continent, enabled the creation of elaborate ornaments and ritual objects that adorned both people and shrines. Architectural forms, including the raised floor granaries and eventually temple structures, bore the marks of continental design. These influences were not merely superficial imitations, but creative adaptations, woven into the fabric of Yamato culture in ways that gave it both local identity and regional connection. The Yamato people thus lived within a world that was simultaneously their own and part of a larger East Asian civilization. The integration of continental influences did not diminish the importance of native traditions, but rather provided new ways of articulating them. The worship of kami continued to structure daily life and political authority, but the presence of Chinese writing allowed myths and genealogies to be recorded in enduring form. The rituals of Shinto continue to affirm the sacred descent of the imperial line, but the prestige of continental recognition gave these rituals added weight. The blending of native and foreign elements created a uniquely Japanese synthesis, one that drew upon the prestige of China and Korea, while maintaining the centrality of Yamato traditions. This process of adaptation became a defining characteristic of Japanese culture, a pattern that would repeat across centuries as new influences arrived and were woven into the fabric of identity. The impact of Korean and Chinese influences on early Yamato culture can be seen as both practical and ideological. Practically, they provided technologies, goods, and administrative tools that strengthened the power of the Yamato rulers. Ideologically, they situated Yamato within a broader cultural sphere, giving its rulers legitimacy not only at home but in the eyes of powerful neighbours. By adopting and adapting these influences, the Yamato kings consolidated their position as both sacred descendants of the sun goddess and legitimate participants in the international order of East Asia. Their authority thus rested on a dual foundation: the native mythology of divine descent and the continental recognition of civilized legitimacy. Together, these elements created a resilient and adaptable system of rule that would carry the Yamato dynasty into the centuries of state formation and cultural flowering that lay ahead. The arrival of Buddhism in the Japanese archipelago marked one of the most profound transformations in the religious and cultural life of the Yamato state, introducing not only a new faith, but an entirely different way of thinking about the relationship between humanity, the cosmos, and political authority. Unlike the worship of kami, which was localized, animistic, and deeply tied to the rhythms of nature and clan rituals, Buddhism brought with it a universal vision of existence, a sophisticated philosophy of suffering and salvation, and a vast cultural apparatus of texts, art, and institutions. The impact of this new religion cannot be measured merely in terms of private devotion, for its arrival reshaped governance, aesthetics, diplomacy, and identity, weaving itself into the very fabric of Yamato society. It was not an immediate or uncontested process, but over time Buddhism became an inseparable part of Japanese life, coexisting with and transforming the older traditions of Shinto without ever fully replacing them. The transmission of Buddhism into Japan came through the Korean peninsula, most notably from the kingdom of Baekje, which maintained close ties with the Yamato court. Historical records recount that in the mid-6th century, Baekje sent an embassy to Yamato bearing gifts that included images of the Buddha, ritual implements, and copies of Buddhist scriptures. These offerings were accompanied by a message extolling the virtues of the new faith, presenting it as a path to enlightenment and as a system that brought prosperity to states that embraced it. The arrival of these items at the Yamato court marked the first formal introduction of Buddhism to Japan, though informal contacts may have familiarized some elites with the religion earlier. The very act of receiving these gifts carried political significance, for it signalled Japan's participation in the broader cultural sphere of East Asia, where Buddhism had already taken root in Korea and China. The initial reaction to Buddhism in Yamato was far from unanimous. Some clans, such as the powerful Soga, embraced the new religion enthusiastically, seeing in it both spiritual merit and political opportunity. The Soga recognized that by aligning themselves with Buddhism, they could claim access to the prestigious cultural world of the continent, enhancing their status within the Yamato court. They became patrons of temples, sponsors of rituals, and advocates of the faith, intertwining their political fortunes with the spread of Buddhism. Other clans, however, resisted, most notably the Mononobe and Nakatomi, who saw the foreign religion as a threat to the native kami, and to their own roles as guardians of Shinto ritual. They argued that the introduction of new gods might anger the native deities, bringing disaster upon the land. This conflict between pro- and anti-Buddhist factions reveals how deeply intertwined religion and politics had become, with the acceptance or rejection of the new faith bound up in struggles for power at the court. The tension came to a head in the late 6th century, culminating in violent clashes between the Soga and their opponents. The eventual triumph of the Soga secured Buddhism's place within Yamato society, but its acceptance was shaped by this conflict. The religion was not adopted wholesale, but was adapted to fit within the existing framework of belief, coexisting with the worship of kami rather than replacing it. This syncretic pattern would become a defining characteristic of Japanese religion, where Shinto and Buddhism existed side by side, often blending in complex and creative ways. The success of the Soga also demonstrates how Buddhism could serve as a tool of political legitimacy, its adoption marking a clan as progressive, cosmopolitan, and aligned with the great civilizations of the continent. By championing Buddhism, the Soga positioned themselves as indispensable intermediaries between Yamato and the broader world of East Asia. Buddhism introduced new rituals, institutions, and symbols that enriched the cultural landscape of Yamato. Temples began to rise, built in architectural styles modelled after Korean and Chinese precedents, but adapted to local materials and sensibilities. The temple became not only a religious space, but a cultural and political centre, housing monks, scriptures, and images of the Buddha. These structures represented a new kind of monumentality, distinct from the Kofun tombs of earlier rulers, projecting not only power, but spiritual universality. Within these temples, monks chanted sutras, conducted ceremonies, and engaged in meditation, introducing practices that contrasted sharply with the communal festivals and nature rites of Shinto. The presence of these institutions signalled that Yamato had entered a new phase of cultural development, one connected to the great Buddhist civilizations of Asia. The philosophy of Buddhism also reshaped the intellectual life of Yamato elites. The teachings of the Four Noble Truths, the Eightfold Path, and the concept of karma introduced new ways of understanding human existence, suffering, and salvation. These ideas offered explanations for the vicissitudes of life that differed from the animistic worldview of kami worship. Whereas misfortune in Shinto was often attributed to the displeasure of local deities or the presence of pollution requiring purification, Buddhism framed suffering as an inherent feature of existence, caused by desire and ignorance, and offered a path to liberation through spiritual practice. This universal vision appealed to some elites, who saw in it a sophisticated system that elevated Japan's cultural standing by connecting it to the intellectual traditions of India, China, and Korea. At the same time, the adaptability of Buddhism allowed it to be interpreted in ways that harmonized with existing beliefs, avoiding direct confrontation with the native worldview. The visual and artistic dimensions of Buddhism had a profound impact on Yamato culture. The introduction of Buddhist images, cast in bronze or carved in wood, brought new artistic techniques and aesthetic sensibilities. Statues of the Buddha and Bodhisattvas introduced forms of sacred representation that contrasted with the naturalistic and abstract symbols of Shinto. These images, often placed in temples and used in rituals, became objects of devotion and inspiration, embodying both spiritual presence and artistic mastery. The production of these images required skilled artisans, many of whom came from Korea or were trained in continental methods, further enhancing the cultural connections between Yamato and its neighbours. Over time, Japanese artists developed their own styles, blending continental influences with local sensibilities to create a distinctive tradition of Buddhist art. The acceptance of Buddhism also brought changes to governance, for the religion carried with it models of kingship that emphasized the ruler's role as a patron and protector of the faith. In China, emperors had presented themselves as Dharma kings, upholders of the Buddhist law whose authority was sanctified by their support for the religion. This model influenced Yamato rulers, who began to frame their legitimacy not only in terms of descent from the sun goddess, but also in terms of their patronage of Buddhism. By building temples, sponsoring monks, and supporting the spread of the faith, they could present themselves as enlightened rulers aligned with universal values. This dual foundation of legitimacy, divine descent from Shinto mythology and cosmopolitan patronage of Buddhism, gave the Yamato state a powerful ideological framework that strengthened its authority both at home and abroad. The integration of Buddhism into Yamato society was not a matter of replacement but of layering. Shinto rituals continued to structure agricultural life, local festivals, and clan identity, while Buddhist practices offered new forms of devotion, philosophy, and artistic expression. Over time, the two traditions intertwined, with Buddhist temples often built near Shinto shrines, and rituals performed in tandem. The concept of Honji Suijaku, which emerged later, framed Kamiya's local manifestations of Buddhist deities, harmonizing the two systems within a single cosmology. This blending allowed Buddhism to root itself deeply in Japanese culture without displacing the older traditions, creating a syncretic religious environment that endured for centuries. The transformation brought by Buddhism extended beyond religion into the broader cultural and intellectual horizons of Yamato. The study of Buddhist texts introduced new forms of scholarship, including philosophy, logic, and ethics. Monks became custodians of learning, preserving and transmitting knowledge that went far beyond ritual practice. Through Buddhism, Japan gained access to the rich intellectual traditions of India and China, expanding the scope of its cultural world. The very act of translating and interpreting Buddhist texts required the development of linguistic and literary skills, further advancing the sophistication of Yamato elites. This intellectual dimension of Buddhism contributed to the flowering of culture that characterized the later Asuka and Nara periods. The introduction of Buddhism also influenced Yamato's place in international relations. By embracing the religion, Yamato aligned itself with the dominant cultural force of East Asia, signaling its participation in the shared civilization that stretched from India through China and Korea to Japan. This alignment elevated Yamato's status in the eyes of its neighbours, marking it as a state that shared in the universal values and institutions of the Buddhist world. Diplomatically, it reinforced alliances, particularly with Baekje, and gave Yamato a platform for cultural exchange with China. In this sense, the adoption of Buddhism was not only a spiritual decision but a strategic one, enhancing Yamato's legitimacy within the East Asian order. The transformation of belief brought about by Buddhism was therefore profound and multifaceted. It introduced new rituals, institutions, philosophies, and artistic forms. It reshaped governance, diplomacy, and intellectual life, and it created a new synthesis with Shinto that enriched Japanese culture. The resistance it initially encountered underscores how significant the change was, but its eventual triumph demonstrates the adaptability of both the new religion and the native traditions it encountered. The Yamato state emerged from this encounter not diminished, but strengthened, its rulers able to present themselves as both heirs of the sun goddess and patrons of the universal Dharma. This dual identity gave Japan a unique cultural foundation, one that continues to shape its religious and political life even in the present day. The introduction of Buddhism had opened the Yamato polity to new currents of thought, diplomacy and cultural expression, but it was during the lifetime of Prince Shotoku in the late 6th and early 7th centuries that these influences were most decisively harnessed and transformed into enduring institutions of governance. Shotoku's reputation stands at the heart of Japan's political and cultural history, remembered not only as a regent and statesman, but also as a visionary who saw the possibilities of blending native traditions with continental models to create a coherent and centralized system of rule. His image in later centuries became larger than life, revered as both a political architect and a cultural saint. But even stripped of legend, his contributions mark a turning point in the consolidation of Yamato authority. Under his guidance, the court began to move beyond a loose federation of clans into something closer to a state, its rulers positioned not merely as clan leaders, but as monarchs who could claim their place within the great civilizations of East Asia. Shotoku was born into the powerful Soga lineage, the very family that had championed Buddhism's introduction into Japan. His mother was of the imperial family, giving him direct access to the throne, while his father's Soga heritage provided the political base that enabled his rise. In this dual identity, Shotoku embodied the convergence of Yamato's two key sources of legitimacy: divine descent through the imperial line and continental sophistication through the Soga. His appointment as regent for his aunt, Empress Suiko, placed him at the centre of power during a critical period of transition, when the court sought to consolidate its position domestically while navigating the complexities of foreign relations with Korea and China. It was in this context that Shotoku advanced reforms and ideas that would redefine the Yamato polity. Perhaps his most famous achievement is the 17-article constitution, a document issued in 604 that set forth principles for governance. Though described as a constitution in modern terms, it was less a legal code and more a moral and philosophical statement of ideals. Drawing upon Confucian, Buddhist and native traditions, the articles emphasized harmony, loyalty to the ruler, the importance of proper behavior, and the necessity of cooperation within the state. The opening article famously declared the centrality of harmony, reflecting Confucian ideals of social order, while later articles stressed reverence for Buddhism and the authority of the monarch. By framing governance in terms of moral duty and collective responsibility, Shotoku provided the Yamato court with a framework that elevated it above the factional struggles of clans and rooted it in universal principles. The document may not have been strictly enforceable as law, but it served as a guiding vision that shaped the ethos of the state. Shotoku also played a decisive role in reforming the structure of administration at the Yamato court. Recognizing the limitations of a system based solely on hereditary clan privilege, he introduced a system of rank that rewarded merit and loyalty rather than bloodline alone. This cap and rank system, modelled after Chinese precedents, organised officials into 12 levels distinguished by colour-coded caps, symbolising their status and authority. By promoting capable individuals from outside the most powerful clans, Shotoku sought to weaken the monopolies of aristocratic lineages and to create a bureaucracy that served the state rather than clan interests. This innovation marked a significant step toward the centralisation of authority, giving the monarch greater control over appointments and ensuring that talent could be recognised and utilised regardless of hereditary ties. Though clan influence remained strong, the precedent of ranked offices set the stage for later reforms that would further institutionalise centralised governance. Diplomacy was another arena in which Shotoku left an indelible mark. During his regency, he sent envoys to the Sui dynasty of China, initiating a series of official exchanges that brought Japan into direct contact with the imperial court of one of the most powerful civilizations of the time. The letters sent by Shotoku's envoys boldly described the Japanese ruler as the son of heaven in the land where the sun rises, addressing the Chinese emperor as an equal rather than as a superior. This was a daring move, but the Sinocentric worldview recognized only the Chinese emperor as the true son of heaven, relegating other rulers to subordinate positions. By asserting equality, Shotoku positioned Japan as an independent and sovereign state within the East Asian order, one that could claim its own legitimacy based on divine descent from Amaterasu. The confidence expressed in these communications reflected both the strength of Yamato's consolidation and Shotoku's vision of Japan as a nation with its own unique place in the world. These embassies to China also brought practical benefits, for they facilitated the transfer of knowledge, technology, and cultural forms. Japanese envoys observed the workings of the Chinese bureaucracy, the grandeur of its capital cities, the sophistication of its legal codes, and the universality of its Buddhist institutions. They returned with books, artifacts, and experts, enriching the Yamato court with new models of governance, architecture, and religious practice. The influence of China under Shotoku's guidance was thus not passive but selective. As elements were adopted and adapted to fit the needs of Japan, the Yamato polity gained prestige at home by presenting itself as aligned with the great civilization of China. while also asserting its independence by framing its ruler as a sovereign equal. This balance of borrowing and self-assertion would remain a defining feature of Japanese diplomacy for centuries. Shotoku's patronage of Buddhism further entrenched the religion within Yamato society. He sponsored the construction of temples, the most famous being Horyuji, which became one of the great centres of Buddhist art and learning in Japan. Under his support, images of the Buddha were cast, scriptures were copied, and monks were trained, establishing the foundations of a Buddhist tradition that would flourish in the archipelago. For Shotoku, Buddhism was not merely a personal faith but a political tool, one that reinforced the legitimacy of the state by presenting the ruler as a Dharma king who upheld universal law. His constitution explicitly affirmed reverence for the three treasures, the Buddha, the Dharma and the Sangha, as essential to governance, integrating Buddhist values into the moral fabric of the polity. By aligning himself with Buddhism, Shotoku linked Yamato not only to Korea and China, but also to the broader Buddhist world that stretched across Asia. The coexistence of Buddhism with Shinto during Shotoku's time exemplifies the syncretic character of Japanese religion. While Shinto rituals continued to structure agricultural life and clan identity, Buddhism offered a universal philosophy and monumental cultural forms that elevated the prestige of the state. Rather than opposing the two traditions, Shotoku fostered their coexistence, allowing each to serve complementary roles. This balance ensured that the adoption of Buddhism did not alienate the native traditions but instead enriched them, creating a layered religious environment that reflected the diversity of Japanese society. Shotoku's role in cultivating this balance helped secure the long-term acceptance of Buddhism, ensuring that it would become an integral part of Japanese culture without displacing Shinto foundations. The image of Shotoku as a cultural and political reformer was magnified in later centuries, when he came to be revered as a saintly figure who embodied wisdom, virtue and devotion. Legends attributed to him extraordinary abilities, such as the capacity to listen to multiple petitions at once or to foresee the future. He was celebrated as a model of enlightened rulership, a figure whose life demonstrated the integration of spiritual devotion and political vision. Whether or not all these stories reflect historical reality, they underscore the enduring impact of his reforms and the way they were remembered as foundational to the Japanese state. His association with both Buddhism and governance ensured that he remained a symbol of the unity of spiritual and political authority, an archetype of what Japanese leadership could aspire to be. Shotoku's contributions must also be understood in the context of the challenges facing the Yamato polity at the time. The court remained dependent on powerful clans, whose rivalries threatened unity, while external pressures from the Korean peninsula demanded a strong and coherent state. His reforms addressed these challenges by strengthening the central authority of the monarch, promoting merit-based governance, and situating Japan within the prestigious cultural world of China and Buddhism. In doing so, he provided the Yamato state with the tools to withstand internal divisions and external threats, securing its position as a centralized polity capable of evolving into a fully developed imperial state. The legacy of Shotoku is thus multifaceted. Politically, he advanced the centralization of power through administrative reforms and moral principles of governance. Diplomatically, he asserted Japan's independence while embracing the cultural benefits of contact with China. Religiously, he championed Buddhism while balancing it with Shinto traditions, embedding the new faith within the fabric of Japanese life. Culturally, he fostered the creation of temples, art and scholarship that enriched the nation's identity. Collectively, these contributions transformed the Yamato polity from a loose federation of clans into a more cohesive state, laying the groundwork for the institutional and ideological developments that would follow in the Nara and Heian periods. When later generations looked back on the formative centuries of the Yamato dynasty, Prince Shotoku's figure loomed large, not only for the reforms he enacted but for the vision he represented. He stood at the crossroads of native tradition and continental influence, forging a path that allowed Japan to remain distinct while also participating in the broader civilization of East Asia. His emphasis on harmony, moral duty, and spiritual devotion provided a model of governance that transcended his own time, resonating across the centuries as an enduring symbol of the possibilities of enlightened rule. The Yamato state that emerged from his regency was no longer merely a coalition of clans, but a polity with a vision of itself as a nation, rooted in divine descent, strengthened by continental wisdom, and guided by principles that combine the sacred and the political into a single order of life. The emergence of the Asuka court represents a decisive moment in the evolution of the Yamato polity, when the loose federations of clans and the ideological legacy of divine descent began to be consolidated into more formal institutions of governance. The Asuka period, roughly spanning the late 6th to early 8th century, was named for the Asuka region in the Yamato basin, where the court established its centre. It was here that the early structures of statehood began to take recognisable form, blending indigenous traditions of clan authority with continental models of bureaucracy, law, and ritual. The court at Asuka was not yet the fully developed imperial state that would flourish in Nara and Heian, but it was the crucible where the fusion of myth, ritual, and politics began to generate a coherent system of governance that could command loyalty across the archipelago. The very location of Asuka carried both practical and symbolic significance. Situated in the fertile Nara basin, surrounded by mountains that provided both protection and definition, Asuka lay at the heart of the Yamato homeland. Its proximity to sacred mountains like Miwa tied the court directly to the spiritual geography of the region, while its accessibility to continental trade routes ensured a steady flow of goods, ideas, and emissaries. By centering the court in Asuka, the rulers of Yamato placed themselves within a landscape that resonated with both divine legitimacy and practical connectivity, anchoring their authority in a place where the sacred and the worldly intersected. The political nature of the Asuka court reflected the balance of power between the central rulers and the great clans that surrounded them. Though the emperor, as a descendant of Amaterasu, was the symbolic apex of authority, the reality of governance depended heavily on powerful lineages such as the Soga, Mononobe, and Nakatomi. These clans controlled key offices, commanded armies, and dominated ritual life, often overshadowing the monarch himself. The Soga in particular exercised enormous influence during the Asuka period, championing Buddhism, arranging imperial successions, and acting as kingmakers within the court. The rivalry between clans produced both instability and innovation, as each sought to advance its position through alliances, reforms, and religious patronage. Governance in Asuka thus emerged not from a single source of authority, but from the interplay of competing lineages within a shared framework of divine descent. The introduction of continental models under figures such as Prince Shotoku began to reshape this system, pushing the court toward greater centralization. The adoption of Chinese-inspired administrative ranks and titles gave the monarch a tool to elevate loyal officials above their hereditary peers, reducing the absolute dominance of the clans. The cap and rank system of 12 levels, introduced in 603, represented one such innovation, signalling that merit and service could be rewarded independently of birth. While clan privilege remained strong, these reforms planted the seeds of a more impersonal bureaucracy, one in which loyalty to the state could coexist with loyalty to lineage. The court at Asuka thus became a site where new models of governance were tested, their success dependent on the ability of the monarch to balance the ambitions of powerful families with the ideals of centralized authority. Buddhism, introduced in the 6th century and promoted vigorously by the Soga and Prince Shotoku, became a defining feature of Asuka governance. Temples such as Horyuji and Asuka-dera rose as symbols of royal patronage, their construction involving resources on a scale that rivaled the Kofun tombs of earlier rulers. These temples were not only religious institutions but also centres of political and cultural activity, housing monks who advised rulers, conducted rituals for state protection, and preserved texts that informed governance. By associating themselves with Buddhism, the rulers of Asuka linked their authority to a universal faith that resonated across East Asia, presenting themselves as Dharma kings whose legitimacy was sanctified by their role as patrons of the three treasures. At the same time, Shinto rituals continued to structure agricultural and clan life, producing a syncretic religious environment in which the authority of the monarch was expressed through both native and continental traditions. The Asuka court also became the centre of foreign diplomacy, engaging with the Korean kingdoms and with the powerful dynasties of China. Envoys were dispatched to the Sui and later Tang courts, carrying messages that proclaimed the independence and sovereignty of the Yamato ruler. These embassies brought back not only recognition and prestige but also knowledge of Chinese law codes, administrative structures, and cultural practices. The willingness of the Asuka court to learn from these models demonstrates both ambition and adaptability, for the rulers sought not merely to imitate China, but to adapt its institutions to Japanese conditions. The correspondence with China, bold in its assertion of equality, reveals the growing confidence of Yamato rulers, who could now envision themselves not only as leaders within the archipelago, but as sovereigns recognized in the broader East Asian order. Domestically, the nature of governance at Asuka was marked by experimentation and gradual formalization. Laws began to be codified, though still in embryonic form compared to the detailed legal systems of China. Titles and ranks proliferated, providing the monarch with a means of structuring the court hierarchy. Ritual life became increasingly tied to the authority of the emperor, who presided over both Shinto ceremonies to honor the kami and Buddhist rituals to secure protection for the state. These developments reflect the dual foundation of Asuka governance: native traditions of divine descent and ritual mediation, combined with continental models of bureaucracy and law. The result was a system that remained fluid, shaped by the interplay of clans and monarchs, yet increasingly oriented towards centralization and formality. The architectural landscape of Asuka reflected this transformation. Palaces were constructed in continental styles, their layouts reflecting Chinese models of order and hierarchy. Temples, with their pagodas and lecture halls, introduced entirely new forms of monumental architecture, reshaping the visual culture of Yamato. These structures projected both power and sanctity, their very presence reinforcing the authority of the court. Unlike the Kofun tombs, which looked backward toward the memory of deceased rulers, the temples and palaces of Asuka looked forward, embodying the ideals of a living state that sought to define itself in relation to both its own traditions and the broader world of East Asia. The role of women in Asuka governance also deserves attention, for several empresses played decisive roles in ruling and shaping the polity. Figures such as Empress Suiko provided continuity and authority during times of transition, their reigns demonstrating the flexibility of succession within the imperial line. The prominence of women at the Asuka court reflects both the strength of maternal lineage in the imperial family and the willingness of the polity to adapt to circumstances in order to maintain stability. These female rulers were not anomalies but integral participants in the evolving nature of governance, their reigns underscoring the adaptability of the system as it moved toward greater centralization. The consolidation of power at Asuka was not without resistance. Rival clans challenged the dominance of the Soga, and disputes over succession frequently destabilized the court. Yet these struggles, far from preventing the evolution of governance, often drove innovation, as each faction sought new ways to legitimize its authority. The eventual Taika reforms of 645, launched after the fall of the Soga, represent the culmination of these processes, a dramatic attempt to centralize authority under the emperor by adopting Chinese-inspired systems of land distribution and taxation. The groundwork for these reforms was laid at Asuka, where the experiments in rank, law, ritual and diplomacy had already begun to reshape the Yamato polity into a more coherent state. The nature of early governance at Asuka can therefore be understood as transitional, a period in which the court moved beyond the clan-based politics of earlier centuries toward a centralised state modelled on continental precedents, yet rooted in native traditions. It was a system that combined myth and law, ritual and bureaucracy, personal ambition and universal ideals. The court at Asuka was not yet the fully developed imperial state, but it was the laboratory where the key elements of governance were forged, tested and refined. Its rulers were heirs of Amaterasu and patrons of the Buddha, mediators between heaven and earth, and participants in the International Order of East Asia. From this crucible emerged the institutions, ideologies and cultural forms that would define Japanese statehood for centuries to come. The fall of the Soga clan in the mid-7th century created both a crisis and an opportunity for the Yamato state. For decades, the Soga had dominated the imperial court, wielding power through their control of succession and their patronage of Buddhism. Their downfall in 645 at the hands of a coalition led by Prince Naka no Oe and Nakatomi no Kamatari did not merely mark the end of one family's supremacy, but ushered in a new vision of governance for the Japanese archipelago. This vision was embodied in what came to be known as the Taika Reforms, a sweeping program of political, economic and administrative change that sought to transform the Yamato polity from a loose federation of clans into a centralised state modelled on the great dynasties of China. The reforms marked a turning point in Japanese history, for they represented the first systematic attempt to codify the principles of centralised rule and to bind the entire realm under the direct authority of the emperor. The immediate context of the reforms was shaped by both domestic rivalries and external pressures. Domestically, the imperial line faced the persistent challenge of powerful clans whose autonomy threatened central control. The Soga had demonstrated how a single family could overshadow the throne, and their elimination revealed the need for new structures that would prevent such monopolies from recurring. Externally, the rise of the Tang dynasty in China and the consolidation of power in Korea underscored the vulnerability of a fragmented Japan. The defeat of Baekje, Japan's ally, by the combined forces of Tang and Silla in the mid-7th century demonstrated the geopolitical stakes of the region and the necessity of a strong and unified state capable of defending its interests. Against this backdrop, the leaders of Yamato recognized that survival required transformation, and they turned to the powerful models provided by China as inspiration for their reforms. The Taika reforms were proclaimed in 646, shortly after the coup against the Soga, and their very name, meaning great change, reflected their ambition. The central principle of the reforms was the assertion that all land and people in the realm belonged ultimately to the emperor. This declaration struck at the heart of the clan-based system, in which powerful lineages controlled vast territories and populations as their hereditary possessions. By declaring land and people to be under imperial ownership, the reforms sought to strip the clans of their independent bases of power and to reassert the primacy of the monarch. In practice, this meant the introduction of systems of taxation, land redistribution, and administration that place subjects under the direct authority of the central state, rather than under the control of local aristocrats. One of the most significant measures of the reforms was the system of land redistribution known as the Handenshu system. Under this arrangement, land was to be periodically allocated to households according to the number of adult members, with the understanding that it remained the property of the state. Farmers were allowed to cultivate the land and pass its use to their heirs, but they could not sell or permanently transfer it, for ultimate ownership rested with the emperor. This system was designed both to ensure equitable access to land and to prevent the accumulation of large estates by powerful clans. By tying landholding to the state rather than to lineage, the reforms created a mechanism for direct control over the rural population, the foundation of the economy. Taxes in the form of rice, labour and military service were then levied directly on these households, providing the central government with resources that had previously flowed to the clans. The Taika reforms also sought to restructure the administrative apparatus of the state. Drawing inspiration from Chinese models, they established a system of provinces and districts, each governed by officials appointed by the central court. This system replaced the older reliance on hereditary clan chieftains with a bureaucracy that, in theory, served the emperor. Provincial governors were charged with collecting taxes, overseeing land distribution, and maintaining order, while district officials managed local affairs. Though the reach of this system was uneven and clan influence persisted in many areas, its creation marked a decisive step towards centralized administration. For the first time, the Yamato state possessed a framework through which it could extend its authority across the archipelago, projecting the power of the court into regions that had previously been only loosely connected. The reforms also introduced changes to court ritual and ideology that reinforced the supremacy of the emperor. The monarch was no longer merely the first among clan leaders, but was elevated as the sovereign ruler of the entire land, a position sanctified by divine descent and bolstered by continental models of kingship. Court ceremonies emphasized the emperor's role as the mediator between heaven and earth, while Buddhist rituals underscored his status as a Dharma king who protected the faith and the people. The language of the reforms, influenced by Chinese terminology, presented the emperor as the axis of the realm, the source of law, and the owner of all land and people. This ideological shift provided the foundation for later developments in imperial authority, framing the monarch as the embodiment of the state itself. The military dimension of the reform should not be overlooked. By asserting control over land and people, the state also gained direct access to manpower for conscription. The new system of household registration ensured that adult males could be identified and called upon for military service, creating a national army in place of clan-based war bands. This shift strengthened the capacity of the central government to defend the realm against external threats and to enforce its authority internally. The organisation of conscription, combined with the taxation of resources, provided the material basis for the centralisation of power. At the same time, the reforms emphasised the role of the emperor as the commander of the realm's forces, further consolidating military authority in the throne. The Taika reforms also transformed the role of aristocratic clans within the state. While they lost direct control over land and people, they were incorporated into the new system through appointments to high offices and ranks at court. The cap and rank system introduced earlier was expanded, and a more elaborate hierarchy of titles was created, assigning status and responsibility within the bureaucracy. This system allowed the emperor to reward loyalty and service while maintaining aristocratic support for the reforms. The clans thus remained integral to governance, but their authority was now mediated through the central court rather than exercised independently. In this way, the reforms both curtailed and preserved aristocratic power, channeling it into the service of the state. The ideological significance of the Taika reforms was amplified by their timing and presentation. They were proclaimed as an imperial edict, emphasizing the emperor's initiative and authority, and were linked explicitly to the need for unity and strength in the face of external threats. The defeat of Baekje and the looming power of Tang China provided a stark reminder of the dangers of disunity, and the reforms were framed as the necessary response to these challenges. By situating the reforms within a narrative of survival and destiny, their architects secured support for measures that otherwise might have met with greater resistance. The reforms thus reveal the interplay of domestic politics, foreign relations, and ideological vision in the shaping of early Japanese statehood. The long-term impact of the Taika reforms was profound, though not all of their provisions were fully realized. The Hananshu system of land redistribution, for example, faced challenges of enforcement, as powerful families found ways to circumvent its restrictions and accumulate estates. Over time, the principle of state ownership of land eroded, giving rise to the private estates, or shun, that would dominate later periods. Yet even with these limitations, the reforms set in motion a process of centralization that permanently altered the political landscape. The idea that land and people belonged to the emperor remained a cornerstone of imperial ideology, even when its practical application faltered. The administrative framework of provinces and districts persisted, providing the foundation for later reforms and institutions. The elevation of the emperor as the sovereign ruler of a centralized state became the defining feature of Japanese governance, shaping the evolution of the polity for centuries. Culturally, the Taika reforms reinforced Japan's participation in the broader East Asian world. By adopting Chinese models of administration, law, and ideology, the Yamato state presented itself as a civilized polity aligned with the standards of the Great Tang dynasty. Envoys to China brought back not only knowledge of governance but also art, literature, and religious practices that enriched the Asuka court. The reforms thus situated Japan firmly within the cultural sphere of East Asia while also asserting its independence and uniqueness. By blending continental models with native traditions, the Yamato rulers created a system that was recognizably Japanese, a synthesis of foreign inspiration and local adaptation that reflected the resilience and creativity of their polity. The Taika reforms therefore stand as a landmark in the centralization of power under the Yamato dynasty. They represented the first comprehensive attempt to restructure the relationship between ruler, land, people, and clans, laying the foundations for a state that could project its authority across the archipelago. Though their implementation was uneven, and their provisions subject to erosion over time, their significance lies in the vision they articulated, a vision of Japan as a centralized sovereign polity ruled by a monarch who was both the descendant of the sun goddess and the sovereign of all land and people. From this vision emerged the structures, ideologies, and institutions that would define Japanese governance in the centuries to come. The reforms and experiments of the Asuka period laid the groundwork for a decisive transformation in the nature of the Japanese state, a transformation symbolized most dramatically by the establishment of the first permanent capital at Nara in the early 8th century. For centuries, the seat of the Yamato court had shifted with each new ruler, moving from palace to palace in accordance with the belief that the death of a monarch brought spiritual impurity to his residence. But by the beginning of the 8th century, the leaders of Japan had embraced a new vision of governance, one inspired by the permanence and grandeur of the great capitals of China. The founding of Heijō-kyo, as the Nara capital was officially named, represented a declaration that the Yamato polity had matured into a centralized and enduring state, one capable of projecting its authority through monumental architecture, codified law, and universal religious institutions. The decision to construct a permanent capital reflected both practical needs and ideological aspirations. Practically, a stable seat of government allowed for the development of a permanent bureaucracy, the accumulation of records, and the establishment of enduring institutions. The constant relocation of the court had disrupted administration, scattering archives and hindering the growth of centralized governance. By fixing the capital in one place, rulers could ensure continuity and efficiency. Ideologically, the creation of a grand city modelled after the Tang capital of Chang'an signalled Japan's place within the broader East Asian world. The layout of Heijō-kyo, with its grid plan, broad avenues, and imposing palace complex, projected order, authority, and participation in the shared civilization of the continent. The city was not only a practical centre of administration, but also a stage upon which the power and legitimacy of the state could be displayed. Construction of the capital began in 710, under the reign of Empress Genmei, and the city soon grew into a vibrant hub of political, religious, and cultural life. Covering an area of nearly 5 square kilometres, Heijō-kyo was laid out in a grid pattern that reflected Chinese cosmological principles, aligning the city with the cardinal directions and placing the imperial palace at its northern centre. From this position, the emperor presided symbolically over the entire realm, his palace representing the axis of the state. The southern avenue leading to the palace served as a ceremonial thoroughfare, used for processions and rituals that reinforced the grandeur of the monarchy. Within the city, government offices, markets, temples, and residences created a landscape of hierarchy and order, mirroring the social and political structure of the realm. The very geography of the capital, thus embodied the ideals of centralized authority and cosmic harmony. The building of Nara was accompanied by the codification of law, another step towards centralization and formalization of governance. Inspired by the Tang legal codes, the Yamato court adopted the Ritsuryo system, a comprehensive body of criminal and administrative law designed to regulate every aspect of society. The Taiho Code, issued in 701, and its later revision, the Yoro Code of 718, established a framework that combined Confucian ideals of hierarchy and duty with practical mechanisms for taxation, conscription, and administration. The Ritsuryo system divided the government into ministries, each responsible for specific functions such as finance, justice, ritual, and military affairs. Provinces and districts were organized under appointed officials, ensuring that central authority reached into the localities. Registers of households and land were compiled, providing the basis for taxation and conscription. Together, these measures transformed the Yamato state into a bureaucratic monarchy, its authority expressed through law as well as lineage. The Ritsuryo codes articulated not only rules of governance, but also ideals of moral order. Confucian principles emphasized loyalty to the ruler, filial piety within families, and harmony within society, values that were embedded in the legal system as guiding principles. The emperor was presented as the ultimate source of law, his authority sanctified by both divine descent and moral responsibility. Officials were expected to conduct themselves with propriety, honesty, and diligence, reflecting the Confucian ideal of virtuous service. In this way, the law was not merely a set of regulations, but a framework for shaping society according to universal values, aligning the conduct of individuals with the cosmic and political order. The codification of law thus reinforced the ideological foundations of the state, presenting it as both a practical system of governance and a moral order that encompassed all aspects of life. The creation of Nara as a permanent capital and the adoption of the Ritsuryo system represented the culmination of centuries of continental influence. From the introduction of rice cultivation and metallurgy to the spread of Buddhism and Confucian thought, Japan had absorbed and adapted models from Korea and China. With the building of Nara, these influences were brought together into a coherent whole, producing a state that was recognizably Japanese yet firmly situated within the East Asian cultural sphere. The grandeur of the city, the sophistication of the bureaucracy, and the universality of Buddhism proclaimed that Japan had arrived as a centralized monarchy capable of standing alongside its neighbors. At the same time, the selective adaptation of these influences ensured that the system reflected Japanese traditions and conditions, blending foreign inspiration with native continuity. Religion played a central role in the life of the Nara capital, reinforcing the authority of the state and providing a universal framework for identity. Buddhism, now firmly established, flourished on an unprecedented scale, with temples rising within and around the city. The most famous of these was Todaiji, constructed in the mid-8th century, whose great Buddha hall housed a colossal bronze statue of Vairocana, the cosmic Buddha. Commissioned by Emperor Shomu, the great Buddha represented the universality of Buddhism and the role of the emperor as a Dharma king who upheld and protected the faith. This temple became not only a religious centre, but a symbol of state power, its construction requiring resources on a massive scale and mobilizing labour from across the realm. The fusion of religious devotion and political authority in such projects demonstrates how deeply Buddhism had become intertwined with the identity of the state. Shinto, too, remained integral to governance, its rituals continuing to sanctify the emperor's descent from Amaterasu and to ensure the fertility of the land. Shrines such as Ise maintained their central role, and the coexistence of Shinto and Buddhism in Nara exemplified the syncretic character of Japanese religion. Far from being eclipsed, Shinto was reframed within the broader Buddhist cosmology, its kami understood as manifestations of universal deities, This synthesis allowed the state to embrace the universality of Buddhism while preserving the sacred lineage of the emperor, creating a dual foundation for authority that was uniquely Japanese. Religious life in Nara thus mirrored the broader character of the state itself, a fusion of continental models and native traditions brought together in a coherent and enduring system. The codification of law extended beyond administration and religion into the regulation of everyday life. The Ritsurya codes prescribed rules for clothing, rituals, and ceremonies, structuring the behavior of the elite according to prescribed norms. They defined punishments for crimes, ranging from fines to corporal punishment and exile, reflecting both practical concerns for order and moral ideals of justice. They established systems of landholding, taxation, and conscription that tied households directly to the state. In this way, the law reached into every corner of society, creating a framework within which individuals lived their lives as subjects of the emperor. The authority of the state was thus both visible in the grandeur of the capital and tangible in the daily obligations of its people. The Nara period was not without its challenges. The implementation of the Ritsuryo system was uneven, and powerful families continued to find ways to assert their autonomy. The principle of state ownership of land, central to the Handenshu system, faced erosion as aristocrats and temples accumulated estates exempt from taxation. The ideal of a merit-based bureaucracy often gave way to hereditary privilege and court intrigue. Yet even with these limitations, the establishment of Nara and the codification of law represented a decisive step forward in the centralization of power. The very existence of a permanent capital and a comprehensive legal system marked the maturity of the Yamato state, distinguishing it from its earlier incarnations and providing the foundation for later developments. The cultural flowering that accompanied the building of Nara further reinforced the significance of this transformation. Literature, art, and architecture flourished under the patronage of the court and the temples. The Kojiki, compiled in 712, and the Nihon Shoki, completed in 720, recorded the myths, genealogies, and history of Japan, providing a written narrative that anchored the identity of the state in both divine origins and historical continuity. Poetry collections such as the Manyoshu reflected the voices of both elites and commoners, expressing themes of love, nature, and devotion that enriched the cultural life of the nation. The fusion of continental influences with native creativity produced a distinctive Japanese culture that resonated far beyond the capital. Nara was not only the seat of government, but also the cradle of a national identity, expressed through law, literature, religion, and art. The building of the Nara capital and the codification of law therefore represent one of the most significant milestones in the history of the Yamato people. Together, they signalled the transformation of a polity rooted in clan alliances and divine descent into a centralised state defined by bureaucracy, law, and monumental expression. They embodied the blending of native traditions and continental models, producing a uniquely Japanese synthesis that endured for centuries. They projected authority both domestically and internationally, situating Japan within the great civilizations of East Asia, while asserting its independence and distinctiveness. And they laid the foundations for the cultural, political, and religious developments that would shape the nation through the Heian period and beyond. The establishment of Nara as a permanent capital and the codification of law provided not only the framework for governance, but also the conditions for an unprecedented flowering of culture at the Yamato court. With stability came the opportunity for creativity, and with the resources of the state concentrated in a single location, the arts, literature, and religion could flourish on a scale previously unimaginable. The 8th century became a period when Japan's cultural identity began to take shape in written form, when native traditions were recorded and celebrated, and when continental influences were absorbed and transformed into something distinctly Japanese. The court at Nara was not only a centre of political power, but also a vibrant hub of cultural expression, where poetry, chronicles, ritual and art came together to define what it meant to be Yamato. One of the most significant achievements of this cultural flowering was the compilation of Japan's earliest written histories, the Kojiki and the Nihon Shoki. These works, produced in the early 8th century, combined mythology, genealogy, and historical narrative to create a sweeping account of the origins of the Japanese islands, the descent of the gods, and the lineage of the emperors. The Kojiki, completed in 712, was written in a mixture of Chinese characters and phonetic renderings of Japanese, while the Nihon Shoki, finished in 720, was composed entirely in classical Chinese, the scholarly language of the time. Together they serve not only as historical records, but also as ideological texts, legitimizing the authority of the imperial line by tracing it back to the sun goddess Amaterasu and framing the history of the realm as the unfolding of a divine plan. These chronicles provided the Yamato state with a written identity, a narrative that could be preserved, transmitted, and invoked in support of the monarchy's legitimacy. Alongside these historical works, poetry became a central medium of cultural expression at the court. The Manyoshu, compiled in the latter half of the 8th century, collected more than 4,000 poems composed by emperors, aristocrats, soldiers, and commoners alike. This anthology, whose name means collection of 10,000 leaves, reflected the breadth of Japanese society and the diversity of its voices. Themes of love, longing, nature, loyalty, and grief filled its pages, offering a glimpse into the emotional lives of people across the social spectrum. The use of native Japanese language, rendered through Chinese characters, adapted for phonetic use, marked an important step in the development of a written Japanese literature. The Manyoshu captured the rhythms of a society in transition, blending the universal ideals of Confucian and Buddhist culture with the particular experiences of individuals living in the Japanese archipelago. Its preservation ensured that the voices of the Yamato court and its people would echo across the centuries. Religious life in Nara contributed powerfully to this cultural flowering. Buddhism, firmly established as a state religion, inspired monumental artistic and architectural achievements. Temples such as Todaiji, with its colossal great Buddha statue, stood as testaments to both spiritual devotion and political power. The construction of these temples required the mobilization of vast resources, demonstrating the capacity of the state to command labour and wealth for projects of universal significance. At the same time, they became centres of learning, housing monks who copied texts, composed commentaries, and developed new interpretations of Buddhist doctrine. These intellectual activities linked Japan to the wider Buddhist world, drawing on traditions from India, China, and Korea, while also producing uniquely Japanese expressions of the faith. The blending of religious devotion, political authority, and cultural creativity in the temples of Nara illustrates how central Buddhism had become to the identity of the Yamato court. Shinto, too, remained vital, its rituals continuing to sanctify the emperor's divine lineage and to structure the agricultural calendar. The Is shrine, dedicated to Amaterasu, retained its position as the most sacred site in the realm, rebuilt at regular intervals in accordance with ancient practices that emphasized renewal and continuity. The coexistence of Shinto and Buddhism created a rich and complex religious environment in which the two traditions did not compete but complemented one another. Shinto provided the sacred foundation of the imperial line and the rhythms of agricultural life, while Buddhism offered universal philosophy, monumental art, and the moral framework of kingship. Together, they created a religious synthesis that informed every aspect of cultural expression at the court, from poetry and ritual to architecture and governance. The visual arts also flourished in Nara, enriched by continental influences yet increasingly marked by local innovation. Buddhist sculpture reached new heights of sophistication, with bronze and wooden statues depicting the Buddha, bodhisattvas, and guardian deities in styles that blended Chinese and Korean techniques with Japanese sensibilities. The Great Buddha at Todaiji, cast in bronze and gilded, became the largest such statue in the world, embodying both spiritual presence and political authority. Wall paintings, calligraphy, and decorative arts adorned temples and palaces, reflecting the wealth and sophistication of the court. These artistic achievements were not mere imitations of continental models, but creative adaptations that gave expression to uniquely Japanese ideals of harmony, simplicity, and reverence for nature. The arts of Nara thus embodied the synthesis of foreign inspiration and native tradition that defined the cultural flowering of the Yamato court. The codification of law under the Ritsuryo system also had cultural dimensions, for it provided a framework that shaped the behaviour and values of the elite. Court rituals were prescribed in detail, from the clothing to be worn on ceremonial occasions to the procedures for offering sacrifices and conducting audiences. These rituals became occasions for the performance of cultural identity, reinforcing hierarchy, loyalty, and propriety through carefully choreographed acts. The performance of ritual was itself a cultural achievement, blending music, poetry, and movement into a unified expression of order and authority. The court at Nara thus became a stage on which the ideals of the state were enacted, turning governance into a cultural as well as a political activity. The influence of continental models extended into education and scholarship, further enriching the cultural life of the court. Monks and officials studied Confucian classics, Buddhist scriptures, and Chinese poetry, bringing back knowledge that informed governance, literature, and art. Schools were established to train officials in the skills of administration, ensuring that the bureaucracy could function according to the ideals of the Ritsuryo system. At the same time, the adaptation of Chinese characters to represent Japanese sounds laid the foundation for the development of a native writing system, which would eventually give rise to kana syllabaries. This process of adaptation reflects the broader character of Nara culture, which drew upon continental resources while creatively reshaping them to fit local needs and sensibilities. The cultural flowering of the Yamato court was not confined to the elite. The Manyoshu demonstrates that poetry was composed by soldiers and commoners, as well as aristocrats, suggesting that cultural expression permeated all levels of society. The mobilization of labour for temple construction involved people from across the realm, whose participation in monumental projects gave them a shared sense of identity and purpose. Festivals and rituals brought communities together in collective acts of devotion and celebration, reinforcing bonds of belonging that extended beyond local clans. In this way, the cultural achievements of Nara were not the exclusive possession of the court, but resonated throughout society, shaping the identity of the Japanese people as a whole. The legacy of this cultural flowering extended far beyond the Nara period. The chronicles provided a written identity that anchored Japanese history in both myth and fact, giving future generations a narrative of origin and continuity. The Manyoshu established a tradition of poetry that would flourish in the Heian period and beyond, shaping the sensibilities of Japanese literature for centuries. The temples and sculptures of Nara stood as enduring symbols of religious devotion and artistic mastery, influencing aesthetic ideals long after their construction. The coexistence of Shinto and Buddhism created a religious synthesis that became a defining feature of Japanese culture, shaping both ritual and philosophy in ways that persisted into the modern era. The cultural achievements of the Yamato court thus provided the foundation for the long and rich tradition of Japanese civilization, ensuring that the voices, images, and ideals of the 8th century would echo through history. The flowering of culture at Nara illustrates the intimate connection between political stability and artistic creativity. The establishment of a permanent capital and a codified system of law provided the framework within which literature, art, and religion could flourish. The resources of the state, concentrated in a single location, allowed for monumental projects that embodied both spiritual devotion and political authority. The interaction with continental models provided inspiration and techniques, while the creative adaptation of these influences produced a culture that was uniquely Japanese. In this synthesis, the Yamato court created not only a system of governance, but also a cultural identity that continues to define Japan to this day. The transition from the Nara period to the Heian period represents one of the most important shifts in the long history of the Yamato state, for it was during this time that Japanese political, cultural and religious life assumed many of the forms that would endure for centuries. The establishment of Heian-kyo, later known as Kyoto, as the new capital in 794 was more than a change of residence for the imperial court. It was a deliberate act of reorientation, a conscious effort to refine the structures of governance, to redefine the relationship between religion and state, and to cultivate a uniquely Japanese identity distinct from continental models. The Heian period, lasting nearly 4 centuries, became the age in which Yamato identity was refined and articulated with unprecedented clarity, blending the legacies of divine descent, Buddhist universality, Confucian hierarchy, and native creativity into a synthesis that gave Japan its distinctive character within the East Asian world. The decision to move the capital from Nara to Heian was motivated by both political and religious considerations. Nara, with its great temples and powerful Buddhist institutions, had become a city where the authority of the court was often overshadowed by monastic influence. The construction of monumental temples such as Todaiji had demonstrated the fusion of state and religion, but it also created powerful religious establishments that could rival the authority of the throne. The move to Heian was intended to free the court from the dominance of the Nara clergy, and to establish a capital where imperial authority could be asserted more clearly. At the same time, the new capital was designed to reflect ideals of order, harmony and permanence. Its grid layout modelled on the Tang capital of Chang'an, but adapted to Japanese needs and sensibilities. Heian-kyo was not merely a city, but a statement of intent, a declaration that the Yamato state was both heir to continental civilization and a sovereign polity with its own unique destiny. The geography of Heian-kyo reinforced this vision. Situated in a broad plain surrounded by mountains, with rivers providing natural defences and channels for transport, the site was both practical and auspicious. The alignment of the city according to geomantic principles underscored its connection to cosmic order, while the positioning of the imperial palace at its northern centre symbolised the axis of authority. The grandeur of the city, with its wide avenues, imposing gates and ceremonial spaces, projected the image of a centralised monarchy presiding over a harmonious realm. Yet unlike Nara, Heian did not immediately accumulate vast temple complexes that dominated the political landscape. The deliberate restriction of Buddhist temples to the periphery of the city reflected the court's determination to assert control over religion, integrating it into the state on its own terms rather than being subsumed by it. Politically, the shift to Heian marked the continuation of the Ritsuryo system, but with significant adaptations that reflected the realities of Japanese society. The codes of law and administration remained the formal framework of governance, with provinces and districts overseen by officials appointed by the court. Household registers, taxation, and conscription continued in theory, but in practice the system became increasingly difficult to enforce. The principle of state ownership of land eroded as powerful aristocratic families and temples accumulated private estates, or shun, which were often exempt from taxation. These estates provided the material base for the rise of new centres of power, undermining the fiscal foundations of the central government. Yet rather than collapsing, the system adapted, with the court maintaining its authority through ritual, culture, and the symbolic centrality of the emperor. The Heian period thus reveals the resilience of Yamato identity, capable of preserving its continuity even as the structures of power evolved. The Fujiwara clan emerged as the dominant force at the Heian court, exercising power through their control of the regency and their strategic marriages into the imperial family. By acting as regents for child emperors and as in-laws to reigning monarchs, the Fujiwara positioned themselves as the indispensable intermediaries of governance, shaping policy and controlling access to the throne. Their dominance did not undermine the legitimacy of the imperial line, for the emperor remained the sacred descendant of Amaterasu, but it did shift the practical exercise of power into aristocratic hands. The Fujiwara period illustrates the dual nature of Yamato identity: the emperor as the eternal symbol of divine sovereignty, and the aristocracy as the practical rulers who governed in his name. This arrangement preserved the sanctity of the throne, while allowing for flexibility in the exercise of authority, a pattern that would recur in later Japanese history with the rise of the shogunate. Culturally, the Heian period saw the emergence of a distinctly Japanese aesthetic and literary tradition, one that both absorbed and departed from continental models. While Chinese remained the language of scholarship and official documents, the development of kana syllabaries, hiragana and katakana, allowed for the expression of Japanese language and thought in written form. This innovation opened the way for a flowering of literature that reflected native sensibilities, most famously in works such as The Tale of Genji by Murasaki Shikibu and The Pillar Book by Sei Shonagon. These texts, composed in the elegant court circles of Heian, revealed a world of refined aesthetics, emotional subtlety, and acute observation, articulating values that became central to Japanese identity. The emphasis on mono no aware, the awareness of the transience of life and the beauty of impermanence, captured the essence of a cultural sensibility that distinguished Japan from its continental neighbours. Religion in the Heian period continued the syncretic blending of Shinto and Buddhism, but was also marked by the rise of new Buddhist schools that shaped Japanese spirituality. The introduction of Tenrei Buddhism by Saicho and Shingon Buddhism by Kukai brought esoteric practices, elaborate rituals, and new forms of devotion that enriched the religious landscape. These schools emphasized the universality of enlightenment and the power of ritual to transform reality, offering both rulers and commoners new paths to salvation. Their temples, often located in the mountains surrounding Heian, became centers of spiritual power that complemented the authority of the court. At the same time, Shinto shrines remained central to the sacred legitimacy of the emperor, whose rituals at Ise and other sites affirmed his role as mediator between heaven and earth. The coexistence of these traditions reflects the flexibility and inclusiveness of Yamato identity, capable of integrating diverse religious forms without losing its core. The evolution of Yamato identity during the Heian period was also expressed in art, architecture, and ritual. Court ceremonies became increasingly elaborate, blending Confucian propriety, Buddhist devotion, and Shinto sanctity into performances that reinforced hierarchy and harmony. Palaces and residences were designed according to the Shinden-zukuri style, with open spaces, gardens, and pavilions that reflected the aesthetic ideals of balance and natural beauty. Painting and calligraphy flourished, with native themes and techniques gradually supplanting continental models. The Heian court cultivated a sensibility that valued subtlety, elegance, and emotional depth, creating a cultural identity that was distinctly Japanese even as it retained traces of its continental origins. Yet beneath the elegance of Heian culture lay tensions that would eventually transform the nature of governance. The growth of private estates weakened the fiscal base of the central government, while the increasing reliance on aristocratic families eroded the practical power of the throne. The provincial administration, in theory under the authority of the court, became dominated by local elites and warrior bands who provided security and collected taxes. These seeds of the warrior class were sown in this period, as provincial strongmen and armed retainers began to assert their authority in ways that foreshadowed the rise of the samurai. The evolution of Yamato identity in the Heian period thus contained both the flowering of a refined court culture and the beginnings of a new order that would eventually displace it. The shift to Heian and the evolution of Yamato identity reveal the adaptability and resilience of Japanese culture. By moving the capital, redefining the role of religion, developing a native literature, and cultivating a distinctive aesthetic, The Yamato court articulated a vision of itself that was both continuous with its past and uniquely suited to its present. The divine lineage of the emperor remained the sacred foundation, but it was now expressed through new forms of culture and governance that distinguished Japan from its neighbours. The blending of native and continental elements, the coexistence of ritual and refinement, the balance between symbolism and practicality. These were the hallmarks of a Yamato identity that emerged with clarity in the Heian period. The legacy of this period endures not only in the monuments and texts it produced, but in the very conception of what it means to be Japanese. The tale of Genji, the rituals of the court, the blending of Shinto and Buddhism, the aesthetic ideals of elegance and impermanence, all these became defining features of Japanese civilization. The Heian period represents the moment when Yamato identity was not merely inherited from the past, but consciously cultivated, refined, and expressed in ways that would shape the nation for centuries. It was the age in which Japan declared itself both part of the Great East Asian world and distinct from it, a sovereign realm whose identity was rooted in divine descent, but articulated through cultural forms that were uniquely its own. The Heian period has often been remembered as the golden age of Japanese court culture, a time when the aristocracy at the capital cultivated a world of refinement, ritual, and artistic expression that shaped the ideals of Yamato identity for centuries to come. The life of the court in Heian-kyo was not merely a matter of politics, but an intricate tapestry of ceremonies, poetry, and aesthetic sensibility, woven together into a system where the pursuit of elegance and the performance of ritual became the very substance of authority. The aristocracy of Heian lived in a world apart, shielded from the turbulence of the provinces by layers of ceremony and etiquette, and yet within that insulated world they created a culture of unparalleled refinement, one that produced some of the most enduring works of Japanese literature, and defined the values of an entire civilization. At the heart of Heian court life were the rituals that sanctified and structured the authority of the emperor and the aristocracy. These rituals, drawn from Shinto, Buddhism, and Confucianism, blended sacred and secular elements into ceremonies that affirmed hierarchy, loyalty, and cosmic harmony. The emperor's role as mediator between heaven and earth was expressed through seasonal festivals, harvest rites, and purification ceremonies, which tied the rhythms of the agricultural calendar to the sacred lineage of Amaterasu. At the same time, Buddhist rituals were performed to protect the state, ward off calamities, and secure prosperity, often involving elaborate ceremonies with chanting, offerings, and the participation of monks from the great temples surrounding the capital. Confucian ideals of propriety shaped the etiquette of court audiences, investitures, and diplomatic receptions, ensuring that every gesture reinforced the moral order of society. The calendar of the court was filled with ceremonies, from the grand processions marking the new year to the more intimate rituals of poetry exchanges and seasonal gatherings. Each occasion was governed by precise codes of dress, behaviour, and performance, reflecting the belief that the enactment of order in ritual was a reflection of cosmic harmony. The performance of ritual was itself a form of governance, for it created a shared identity among the aristocracy and reinforced their place within the hierarchy of the court. To participate in these rituals was to affirm one's role as part of the Yamato order, and to excel in them was to gain prestige and influence. Ritual, in the Heian period, was not a matter of empty formality, but the very substance of political and cultural life. Alongside ritual, poetry held a central place in the life of the aristocracy. The composition and exchange of poems were not mere pastimes, but essential skills for anyone seeking influence or recognition at court. Poetry was the language of emotion, diplomacy, and communication, used in love affairs, political alliances, and ceremonial occasions. A well-composed poem could secure favour, express subtle feelings, or demonstrate refined taste, while a clumsy effort could damage one's reputation. Collections of poetry circulated within the court, and anthologies such as the Kokin Wakashu, compiled in the early 10th century, codified the ideals of poetic expression. The emphasis was on elegance, brevity, and emotional resonance, qualities that reflected the broader aesthetic values of the court. The poetic sensibility of the Heian aristocracy was shaped by the concept of mono no aware, the awareness of the fleeting nature of beauty and the sorrow of impermanence. Poems often focused on seasonal changes, the blossoming and falling of cherry blossoms, the passing of autumn leaves, the sound of wind or water, and the emotions these natural phenomena evoked. Love poetry, too, was suffused with this sense of transience, capturing moments of longing, separation, and fleeting encounters. The ability to capture such feelings in verse was seen as the mark of a cultivated individual, someone attuned to the deeper truths of existence and capable of expressing them with elegance. Poetry thus became both an art form and a social practice, binding the aristocracy together in a shared language of refinement. The life of the aristocracy in Heian Kyo was structured not only by ritual and poetry, but also by an elaborate code of etiquette that governed every aspect of daily existence. Clothing, architecture, speech, and movement were all regulated by conventions that reflected status and taste. Aristocrats wore layered robes of silk in colours carefully chosen to match the seasons, their combinations carrying symbolic meanings. Residences were constructed in the Shindenzukuri style, with open halls, sliding screens and landscaped gardens that blurred the boundaries between interior and exterior space. Daily life was filled with small rituals of refinement, from the arrangement of flowers and incense to the composition of impromptu poems and the appreciation of music. To live in the Heian court was to inhabit a world where every detail was imbued with meaning, and where the pursuit of beauty was inseparable from the performance of status. This pursuit of refinement found its most enduring expression in literature, particularly in works written by women of the court. The Tale of Genji, composed by Murasaki Shikibu in the early 11th century, stands as the pinnacle of Heian literature and one of the greatest works of world literature. The novel, often described as the first of its kind, tells the story of the shining Prince Genji and his romantic and political adventures set against the backdrop of Heian court life. Through its intricate narrative, psychological depth, and sensitivity to emotion, the tale of Genji captured the ideals and anxieties of the aristocracy, articulating themes of love, impermanence, and the pursuit of beauty. It provided a mirror of courtly life, simultaneously reflecting and shaping the values of its audience. Other works, such as Sei Shonagon's Pillow Book, offered more personal glimpses into the daily life of the court. Written as a series of observations, lists, and anecdotes, the Pillow Book revealed the wit, humour, and keen perception of a court lady immersed in the rituals and refinements of Heian society. Together, these works illustrate the prominence of women in the literary culture of the period, their writings offering insights into the private and emotional dimensions of courtly life. The voices of Murasaki Shikibu and Sei Shonagon resonate across the centuries, reminding us that the cultural flowering of the Heian court was not the work of rulers and officials alone, but of the aristocratic women whose sensitivity and skill gave expression to the ideals of their age. The Heian aristocracy lived in a world of privilege, insulated from the struggles of the provinces and the growing power of local warriors. Their wealth was derived from the Shun estates, which provided the resources to sustain their refined lifestyles and to sponsor cultural achievements. Yet this insulation was also a vulnerability, for it left the aristocracy increasingly detached from the realities of governance and defence. The court became a world of ritual and literature, a realm where aesthetic sensibility mattered more than political effectiveness. This detachment would eventually contribute to the rise of the warrior class, who filled the vacuum of practical power left by the aristocracy. But in its own time, the world of the Heian aristocracy represented a pinnacle of cultural achievement, a moment when the ideals of Yamato identity were articulated with unparalleled clarity and beauty. The rituals, poetry, and daily life of the Heian aristocracy were not mere diversions but expressions of a worldview that placed harmony, beauty and refinement at the centre of existence. They reflected a belief that the pursuit of elegance was itself a form of moral cultivation, that to live with sensitivity to beauty was to live in accordance with the deeper truths of the cosmos. In this sense, the culture of the Heian court was not a retreat from reality, but a reimagining of it, a world where art and ritual became the medium through which authority was expressed and identity was defined. The legacy of this world endures in Japanese literature, aesthetics and cultural ideals, reminding us that the flowering of the Heian aristocracy was not merely a historical episode but a defining moment in the history of Yamato civilization. By the late Heian period, the glittering world of courtly ritual and refined aesthetics that had defined the Yamato aristocracy began to show its limits, for beneath the elegant surface of poetry exchanges, ceremonies, and carefully cultivated gardens lay structural weaknesses in the political and economic foundations of the state. The Heian court remained the symbolic centre of authority, with the emperor and aristocracy enacting the rituals of sovereignty, but in practice their control over the provinces weakened as power increasingly shifted into the hands of those who commanded military force. Out of this dynamic emerged the warrior class, a new social and political force whose rise gradually exposed the limits of Yamato authority and set Japan on a path toward feudal structures that would define much of its medieval history. The origins of the warrior class can be traced to the growing importance of provincial administration and the realities of landholding under the Shun system. As the Ritsuryo order eroded, the principle of state ownership of land was undermined by the proliferation of private estates, granted to aristocrats, temples and shrines, often with exemptions from taxation and provincial oversight. These estates became economic units that operated semi-independently of the central government, accumulating wealth and power that rivaled the resources of the court itself. To defend their estates, enforce their claims, and manage disputes, landholders increasingly relied on armed retainers, men skilled in the use of weapons and organised for military service. These retainers, drawn from local strongmen and their followers, formed the nucleus of the emerging warrior class. At the same time, the imperial court continued to appoint provincial governors, known as kokushi, whose task was to oversee administration, collect taxes, and maintain order. These governors often found themselves in conflict with local elites and estate managers, leading to the growth of private militias and the reliance on force to assert authority. Over time, some governors themselves became dependent on armed retainers, while others sought to use military power to secure their positions and enrich themselves. The intertwining of provincial administration and private estates created a dynamic in which military strength became increasingly essential, and those who commanded armed followers gained prominence. The court in Heian Kyo may have been the apex of symbolic authority, but in the provinces power was measured in soldiers, not ceremonies. The families that would later dominate the warrior class, most notably the Taira and the Minamoto, traced their origins to branches of the imperial line, or to aristocratic clans who had settled in the provinces. Over generations, these families built power bases through control of estates, alliances with local elites, and the accumulation of military strength. Their legitimacy was enhanced by ties to the imperial family, but their real power lay in their ability to command armed forces that could enforce order, defend property, and wage war. The emergence of these warrior families reflects the broader shift of power away from the Heian court and toward the provinces, where the realities of governance required more than poetry and ritual. The rise of the warrior class exposed the limits of Yamato authority, for the structures of the Ritsuryo system were no longer adequate to control the provinces. Household registers fell into disuse, taxes from estates dwindled, and conscription gave way to reliance on private retainers. The court remained dependent on aristocratic families like the Fujiwara, but even their power was increasingly challenged by the military strength of the Taira and Minamoto. The emperor, though still the sacred descendant of Amaterasu, became more of a symbolic figure than an active ruler, his authority enacted through rituals in Heian-kyo but constrained by the realities of provincial power. The contrast between the world of the court and the world of the provinces became increasingly stark, revealing the gap between the ideals of Yamato sovereignty and the practical limits of its reach. Conflicts between warrior families and aristocratic elites soon escalated into open warfare, most famously in the Hogan and Heiji disturbances of the mid-12th century. These conflicts, sparked by disputes over imperial succession and aristocratic factionalism, provided an arena in which the Taira and Minamoto demonstrated their military prowess. The Taira, under the leadership of Taira no Kiyomori, emerged victorious, establishing themselves as the dominant force at court and marking the first time a warrior family exercised effective control over the imperial government. Kiyomori's rise to power illustrates both the limits and the adaptability of Yamato authority. The emperor remained the sacred ruler, but real power was wielded by a warrior who commanded armies and controlled access to the throne. The ascendancy of the Taira did not last long, for their dominance provoked resistance from rival clans, culminating in the Genpei War at the end of the 12th century. This conflict, fought between the Taira and the Minamoto, devastated the realm and ended with the Minamoto victory at the Battle of Dan no Ura in 1185. The establishment of the Kamakura shogunate under Minamoto no Yoritomo marked a fundamental shift in Japanese history. For the first time, the emperor remained in Kyoto as the symbolic head of state, while effective political and military power was exercised by the shogun from a base in the provinces. The rise of the shogunate reveals the full extent of the limits of Yamato authority, for the sacred lineage of the emperor was preserved, but its political substance was hollowed out, leaving governance in the hands of the warrior class. Yet even in this transformation, the resilience of Yamato identity is evident. The emperor's role as the descendant of the sun goddess and the symbol of national unity was never abolished, even when real power resided elsewhere. The rituals of the court continued. The chronicles of history preserved the divine lineage, and the sacred authority of the throne remained intact. The warrior class, for all its military strength, ruled in the emperor's name, acknowledging the symbolic sovereignty that defined Yamato identity. This arrangement, in which symbolic and practical power were separated, reflects both the limits of Yamato authority and its enduring influence, for the emperor remained indispensable even when his political role was diminished. The rise of the warrior class thus represents both a rupture and a continuity in Japanese history. It revealed the inability of the court to control the provinces through the mechanisms of the Ritsuryo system, exposing the gap between ideology and reality. But it also demonstrated the adaptability of Yamato identity, capable of preserving its sacred lineage and symbolic authority even as new forms of governance emerged. The coexistence of the emperor in Kyoto and the shogun in Kamakura created a dual structure of power that would define Japan for centuries, a system in which the limits of Yamato authority were acknowledged but its significance preserved. The cultural legacy of this period reflects the tension between courtly refinement and military necessity. The aristocracy of Heian-kyo continued to cultivate poetry, literature and ritual, even as the provinces were consumed by warfare. The tale of the Heike, an epic recounting the rise and fall of the Taira, captured both the grandeur and the tragedy of this transformation, blending the aesthetics of impermanence with the harsh realities of conflict. The warrior class themselves adopted and adapted the values of the court, patronizing temples, composing poetry, and participating in rituals, even as they asserted their dominance through arms. The blending of martial strength and cultural refinement illustrates the complexity of this era, when the limits of Yamato authority were exposed but its cultural ideals remained pervasive. The rise of the warrior class and the limits of Yamato authority therefore represent not merely a decline of the court but a transformation of the Japanese state. Power shifted from ritual to military strength, from the capital to the provinces, but the sacred foundation of the emperor's lineage endured, preserving continuity even amid change. The Yamato court may have lost its practical control, but but it retained its symbolic centrality, ensuring that Japanese identity remained rooted in divine descent even as new forms of governance emerged. This duality, born of the tensions of the late Heian period, would shape Japan's medieval history and define the balance between tradition and adaptation in the centuries to come. The rise of the warrior class and the establishment of the Kamakura shogunate marked a profound transformation in the political life of Japan. But even as military leaders assumed the practical responsibilities of governance, the institution of the emperor and the rituals of the Yamato court endured. This persistence of imperial ritual, even in times when the throne's political power was reduced to a shadow of its former self, reveals the extraordinary resilience of the symbolic and spiritual authority that had been cultivated for centuries. From the perspective of practical administration, the emperor in Kyoto wielded little control over provinces dominated by warriors. Yet the rituals of the court, the sacred lineage of Amaterasu, and the ceremonies that affirmed cosmic harmony continued without interruption. In fact, it was precisely in times of upheaval that these rituals gained new significance, for they provided a sense of continuity, legitimacy, and identity in a world otherwise fractured by conflict. The Kamakura period, beginning at the end of the 12th century, illustrates this dynamic clearly. Minamoto no Yoritomo established his military government in Kamakura, far from Kyoto, where he and his successors exercised real control over the provinces through a network of vassals and stewards. Yet Yoritomo did not seek to abolish or replace the emperor. Instead, he ruled in the emperor's name, acknowledging the throne as the sacred source of authority. This arrangement, in which the emperor remained the nominal sovereign while the shogun wielded actual power, underscored the centrality of ritual to the endurance of Yamato identity. Even stripped of political authority, the emperor's role as the mediator between heaven and earth and the performer of sacred ceremonies could not be displaced. The shogunate derived its legitimacy from acting as the custodian of imperial authority, ensuring that the rituals of Kyoto continued to anchor the nation in divine order. The ceremonies of the imperial court remained a constant feature of life in Kyoto, their performance unaffected by the shifting fortunes of warrior governments. Seasonal festivals, enthronement rituals, harvest rites, and purification ceremonies were conducted with the same precision and solemnity as in earlier centuries. The emperor presided over the Daijosai, the great accession ritual that linked him to the sun goddess and to the fertility of the land, even when his ability to enforce decrees or command armies was non-existent. The symbolic weight of these rituals was such that even warrior leaders, whose power rested on military strength, sought imperial sanction for their authority. Yoritomo himself received the title of shogun from the court, and later warrior governments maintained this practice, for without imperial recognition, their rule lacked legitimacy. The throne's role was reduced but never eliminated, and the persistence of its rituals ensured the survival of Yamato sovereignty in symbolic form. Throughout the medieval upheavals of the Kamakura, Muromachi and Sengoku periods, the imperial court often found itself impoverished and politically marginalized, yet its rituals continued, sometimes sustained by the patronage of warrior rulers who recognized their value. During the Muromachi period, for example, the Ashikaga shoguns established their government in Kyoto itself, intertwining their fortunes with those of the imperial family. They sponsored court ceremonies, patronized temples, and supported the compilation of histories and poetry collections, recognizing that their own legitimacy depended on maintaining the appearance of continuity with Yamato traditions. The coexistence of shogunal power and imperial ritual created a system in which political and symbolic authority were separated but mutually reinforcing, each dependent on the other to maintain order and legitimacy. The persistence of imperial ritual during the Sengoku period, when the realm was fractured into domains ruled by competing warlords, is even more striking. As daimyo battled for supremacy, Kyoto often suffered from neglect and devastation, and the court fell into financial ruin. Yet the rituals of the throne did not cease, even when resources were scarce. Emperors continued to preside over ceremonies, often relying on donations from powerful warlords to fund the offerings, costumes, and sacred implements required for performance. These donations were not mere acts of charity, but investments in legitimacy, for warlords who sought to strengthen their claims to rule looked to the emperor for titles, ranks, and symbolic recognition. Even Oda Nobunaga and Toyotomi Hideyoshi, the great unifiers of the 16th century, understood the necessity of imperial sanction, presenting themselves as restorers of order who acted in the name of the throne. The rituals of the Yamato court thus remained indispensable, even in the midst of the most violent disruptions. The endurance of these rituals reflects their role as more than mere political theatre. They embodied the continuity of Japan itself, linking each generation to the divine origins of the nation and affirming the cosmic order in times of chaos. The emperor's participation in rituals connected the present to the mythic past of Amaterasu, ensuring that the sacred lineage remained unbroken. The agricultural rites tied the fertility of the land to the authority of the throne, reinforcing the idea that prosperity depended on the emperor's mediation. Even when political power was exercised by shoguns or warlords, these rituals maintained a sense of unity and identity that transcended the divisions of the time. They provided a stable foundation upon which shifting regimes could build, ensuring that Japanese identity remained rooted in the sacred traditions of Yamato. The symbolic weight of the imperial institution was such that warrior rulers often went to great lengths to protect and promote it, even as they exercised practical control. The Ashikaga shogun sponsored the compilation of official histories, known as the Six National Histories, which trace the continuity of the imperial line. They also patronized the arts of the court, including poetry and no theatre, integrating cultural expression into their governance. Hideyoshi, though a commoner who rose to the highest levels of power, carefully cultivated his relationship with the emperor, sponsoring court rituals and presenting himself as the defender of imperial tradition. The Tokugawa shoguns, who established their rule in the 17th century, institutionalized this relationship, preserving the rituals of the emperor in Kyoto while maintaining practical power in Edo. In each case, the persistence of imperial ritual ensured that Yamato sovereignty remained intact, even when its political form was radically transformed. The resilience of imperial ritual during medieval upheavals can be understood as a testament to the adaptability of Japanese political culture. Rather than collapsing in the face of warrior domination, the imperial institution redefined itself as the symbolic core of the nation, relinquishing practical control while preserving its sacred functions. This arrangement allowed for continuity amid change, providing legitimacy to new regimes while maintaining a sense of unity and identity for the people. The rituals of the court did not depend on armies or wealth, but on belief, and as long as the emperor performed them, the sacred order of Yamato remained unbroken. At the same time, the persistence of these rituals underscores the unique nature of Japanese sovereignty, in which symbolic and practical power were separated yet inseparably linked. The emperor's authority derived from his role as the descendant of the sun goddess and the performer of sacred rites, while the shoguns exercised the military and administrative power necessary to govern. Neither could fully replace the other. The shoguns required imperial sanction to legitimize their rule, and the emperor required shogunal support to sustain the performance of rituals. This symbiotic relationship preserved the dual structure of Japanese governance, ensuring the survival of both institutions through centuries of upheaval. The persistence of imperial ritual through medieval upheavals thus illustrates both the limits and the resilience of Yamato authority. Politically, the court was often weak, impoverished, and marginalized, its decrees ignored by warlords who ruled the provinces by force. But symbolically, the court remained central, its rituals embodying the sacred order that defined Japan. The endurance of these rituals ensured that the divine lineage of the emperor was never broken, that the connection to Amaterasu remained alive, and that the identity of the nation continued to be anchored in the traditions of Yamato. In this way, the rituals of the court outlasted the rise and fall of shogunates, the battles of warlords, and the chaos of civil war, preserving continuity in the midst of change. The legacy of this endurance is profound. By maintaining its rituals through centuries of upheaval, the imperial institution preserved the foundation upon which later periods of centralization could be built. When the Tokugawa shogunate stabilized the realm, it did so with the emperor's rituals still intact. When the Meiji Restoration sought to modernize Japan, it did so by reviving the political authority of the throne, whose legitimacy had been preserved by centuries of ritual continuity. The persistence of imperial ritual thus ensured not only the survival of the Yamato lineage, but the possibility of its revival, proving that even in times of decline and upheaval, the sacred foundations of Japanese identity endured. This survival of the Yamato lineage into the modern era is one of the most extraordinary stories of political and cultural continuity in world history. Few dynasties anywhere have maintained such an unbroken succession, stretching back more than a millennium and a half, claiming descent from mythic beginnings while adapting through countless upheavals. The endurance of the imperial house was not inevitable. It was achieved through a delicate balance of ritual persistence, symbolic centrality, and pragmatic accommodation to shifting political realities. From the rise of the warrior class to the age of global empires, from the devastation of civil war to the transformations of modernization, the Yamato lineage endured by remaining flexible in practice while steadfast in identity. Its survival into the modern era ensured that Japan entered the age of nation-states not as a people reinventing sovereignty from scratch, but as one with a living connection to an ancient and sacred tradition. By the time the Tokugawa shogunate consolidated power in the early 17th century, the role of the emperor had long been reduced to symbolic functions. Political power was exercised in Edo, where the shoguns ruled through a tightly controlled system of domains, vassals, and bureaucratic regulation. Yet even under Tokugawa rule, the imperial family in Kyoto continued its rituals, its lineage preserved as the sacred core of the nation. The shoguns patronized the court, provided funds for its ceremonies, and maintained the fiction of imperial sovereignty even as they monopolized actual power. The emperor remained indispensable for conferring legitimacy. Decrees of the court were used to sanctify shogunal authority, and the rituals of enthronement continued to affirm the divine descent of each monarch. The Tokugawa period thus reinforced the dual structure of Japanese governance, in which symbolic and practical authority coexisted, ensuring the survival of the Yamato lineage through centuries of stability. The endurance of the imperial family during the Tokugawa period was not passive. The court cultivated its cultural role, preserving the traditions of poetry, calligraphy, ritual and scholarship that had long defined Yamato identity. While samurai dominated politics and administration, the imperial household maintained the continuity of cultural and religious practices, ensuring that the sacred lineage remained visible and revered. This cultural authority, though often overshadowed by the political might of the shogunate, became a reservoir of legitimacy that could be drawn upon when the old order began to crumble. The court's ability to persist without direct involvement in governance allowed it to avoid entanglement in political rivalries, preserving its sanctity for the moment when it could be restored to prominence. The collapse of the Tokugawa order in the mid-19th century provided precisely that moment. Faced with external pressures from Western powers and internal unrest, the shogunate struggled to maintain its authority. Commodore Perry's arrival in 1853 and the subsequent opening of Japan to foreign trade exposed the weaknesses of Tokugawa isolation, while samurai discontent and peasant uprisings undermined stability. In this climate of crisis, reformers and revolutionaries turned to the emperor as the symbol of national unity and renewal. The Meiji Restoration of 1868 restored political authority to the throne, presenting it as the revival of ancient Yamato sovereignty and the foundation of a modern Japanese state. The emperor, long a figure of ritual and culture, was reimagined as the active sovereign of a modern nation. His lineage invoked legitimate radical reforms that transformed Japan into a centralized, industrializing power. The endurance of the Yamato lineage was crucial to the success of the Meiji project. Unlike many nations that constructed new symbols of sovereignty during modernization, Japan could draw upon the living tradition of an imperial house that claimed descent from the sun goddess, and had persisted through every upheaval in history. The Meiji leaders framed their reforms not as a break with the past, but as a restoration of the original authority of the emperor stripped away by centuries of warrior rule. The new constitution of 1889 enshrined the emperor as the head of state, combining sacred lineage with modern political authority. This continuity allowed Japan to modernize while maintaining a deep sense of cultural identity, presenting the nation as both ancient and modern, rooted in tradition yet capable of embracing change. The modern role of the emperor was carefully crafted to embody both sacred and national functions. The Meiji state emphasized Shinto as the foundation of national identity, promoting it as the ancient religion of Japan and linking it directly to the imperial lineage. State Shinto was established, with shrines across the nation dedicated to the worship of the kami and the affirmation of the emperor's divine descent. Rituals that had once been confined to Kyoto were now nationalized, performed as symbols of unity for all Japanese people. The emperor became not only the ruler of the state, but the living embodiment of the nation itself, a figure who stood at the intersection of myth, history, and modernity. This redefinition of the throne gave the Yamato lineage a central role in the construction of Japanese nationalism, ensuring its endurance in the new age of global competition. Yet the endurance of the Yamato lineage into the modern era was not without controversy or challenge. The exaltation of the emperor during the Meiji and subsequent Taisho and Showa periods intertwined the sacred lineage with the militarization of the state. The emperor became the supreme commander of the armed forces, his divine descent invoked to justify expansion and conquest. The wars of the early 20th century, culminating in the devastation of World War II, revealed the dangers of conflating sacred tradition with political and military power. The defeat of Japan in 1945 brought occupation, reform, and the stripping away of the emperor's political role. For the first time in history, the throne faced the possibility of abolition, its survival uncertain in the face of external demands for democratization. Yet once again, the Yamato lineage endured. Under the post-war constitution of 1947, the emperor was redefined as the symbol of the state and of the unity of the people, a position stripped of political authority but retaining profound cultural and symbolic significance. The rituals of enthronement continued, the sacred lineage was preserved, and the imperial household remained central to Japanese identity. The endurance of the Yamato lineage into the post-war era illustrates its extraordinary adaptability. No longer the ruler of a divine empire, the emperor became a figure of unity in a democratic nation, embodying continuity without wielding power. This redefinition allowed the throne to survive one of the greatest crises in Japanese history, ensuring that the ancient lineage of Amaterasu's descendants remained unbroken. The survival of the imperial family into the modern era also reflects the deep cultural attachment of the Japanese people to the traditions of Yamato. Even as political systems changed, from Ritsuryo codes to shogunates, from restoration monarchies to constitutional democracies, the emperor remained a constant presence, his rituals tying the present to the mythic past. The enthronement of Emperor Naruhito in 2019, accompanied by ancient ceremonies that trace their origins to the earliest centuries of the dynasty, illustrates the persistence of these traditions in contemporary life. The endurance of the Yamato lineage is not merely a historical curiosity, but a living reality, a testament to the capacity of cultural symbols to survive and adapt across millennia. The endurance of the Yamato lineage into the modern era thus represents both continuity and transformation. The imperial house has survived by adapting to changing circumstances, relinquishing political power when necessary, embracing symbolic roles when appropriate and embodying the identity of the nation in ways that resonate with each generation. From ritual performances in Kyoto to constitutional monarchy in Tokyo, from divine sovereign to symbol of unity, the Yamato lineage has remained the thread that connects the present to the past. Its endurance has provided Japan with a unique form of identity, one rooted in ancient myth and sustained through the realities of history, ensuring that the people of Japan entered the modern world not as a nation without a past, but as heirs to the oldest continuous monarchy in existence. The story of the Yamato lineage is not simply a tale of emperors, rituals, and political adaptations across the centuries. It is the story of how a people wove their collective identity around a dynasty that has endured longer than any other in human history. From the earliest myths of Amaterasu and the descent of her divine offspring, through the creation of the Nara and Heian capitals, through the turbulence of medieval shogunates, the flowering of courtly refinement, the rise of the warrior class, the shocks of modernization, and the crises of the 20th century, the Yamato house has remained the constant axis of Japan's self-understanding. Its legacy lies not only in continuity, but in its ability to embody the resilience, adaptability, and cultural synthesis that have defined Japan itself. To speak of the Yamato is to speak of the thread that binds together myth and history, sacred descent and political change, cultural refinement, and national survival. One dimension of this legacy is the way the Yamato lineage created a living link between myth and governance. The claim of descent from the sun goddess Amaterasu was not a mere story, but the ideological foundation of sovereignty, a narrative that bound rulers to the cosmos and sanctified their authority. This divine connection gave Japanese rulers a unique legitimacy, one that could not be replicated by military strength or bureaucratic skill alone. Even when shoguns, warlords, or reformers held real power, they did so in the name of the emperor, whose sacred lineage provided the ultimate source of legitimacy. This intertwining of myth and governance ensured that Yamato authority was never completely broken, even when its practical power was eclipsed. The survival of this mythic foundation into the modern era reveals the extraordinary persistence of a cultural narrative that has shaped Japanese identity across millennia. Another enduring aspect of the Yamato legacy lies in its capacity to synthesize diverse influences into a coherent and uniquely Japanese identity. From its earliest centuries, the Yamato state absorbed elements from Korea and China, adopting Buddhism, Confucianism, administrative systems, and artistic forms. Yet rather than being overwhelmed, it transformed these influences into something distinctly Japanese. Shinto and Buddhism coexisted. The Ritsuryo codes were adapted to local realities, and Chinese literary forms gave way to the creation of kana syllabaries and native literature. The Yamato court cultivated a sensibility that valued elegance, harmony, and impermanence, ideals expressed in poetry, architecture, and ritual. This capacity for synthesis became a hallmark of Japanese identity, allowing the nation to modernize in the 19th century without losing its sense of continuity, and to adapt to globalization in the 20th and 21st centuries while preserving its unique traditions. The Yamato legacy is also found in the resilience of its institutions. The imperial family weathered crises that might have destroyed any other dynasty. The dominance of powerful clans in the Asuka and Nara periods, the rise of the Fujiwara in the Heian court, the ascendancy of the Taira and Minamoto in the 12th century, the establishment of shogunates that relegated the emperor to symbolic status, the chaos of the Sengoku era, the pressures of Western imperialism, and the devastation of World War II. Through all of these upheavals, the Yamato lineage survived by adapting to changing circumstances, ceding practical authority when necessary, while preserving ritual and symbolic functions. This resilience ensured that the dynasty remained intact even when its role was radically transformed. The fact that the Yamato house survived into the modern era, when so many dynasties across the world collapsed, attest to the strength of its symbolic foundations and its ability to embody continuity amid change. The role of ritual in sustaining the Yamato legacy cannot be overstated. Ceremonies such as enthronements, harvest rites, and the great Daijosai accession ritual tied each emperor to the mythic origins of the nation and reaffirmed the sacred order of the cosmos. These rituals were not dependent on political power. They continued even in times of poverty and weakness, sustained by belief and tradition. Their performance created a sense of unity and continuity that transcended the divisions of clan rivalry, warrior rule, and foreign influence. The persistence of these rituals ensured that the sacred dimension of Yamato identity remained alive, providing a foundation that could be invoked in times of restoration or reform. The endurance of these practices into the present day illustrates their central role in defining Japanese identity across generations. The Yamato legacy also shaped the cultural ideals that continue to define Japan. The poetry of the Manyoshu, the refined aesthetics of the Heian court, the impermanence captured in the tale of Genji, the discipline of Zen, and the devotion expressed in Shinto rituals all bear the imprint of the imperial tradition that nurtured them. The court was not merely a political institution, but a cultural engine, preserving and promoting values that became central to Japanese civilization. Even when warrior rulers dominated, they adopted the rituals and aesthetics of the court, ensuring that Yamato ideals permeated the entire structure of society. The persistence of these values, harmony, refinement, reverence for nature, and respect for continuity, reveals the depth of the Yamato legacy in shaping not only governance, but the very sensibility of a people. In the modern era, the Yamato legacy became central to the construction of national identity. The Meiji Restoration framed the emperor as the embodiment of the nation, linking modernization to ancient sovereignty. State Shinto and imperial rituals were used to unite the people, creating a sense of shared destiny rooted in the continuity of the Yamato lineage. Even after the catastrophe of World War II, when the emperor was stripped of political power, the symbolic role of the throne endured, enshrined in the post-war constitution as the symbol of the state and the unity of the people. This continuity ensured that Japan could reinvent itself as a democratic nation without severing its connection to its past. The endurance of the Yamato lineage provided a foundation of stability in a century of upheaval, reinforcing the sense that Japanese identity was not something newly constructed but deeply rooted in history. Globally, the Yamato legacy holds a unique place as the oldest continuing hereditary monarchy in existence. While dynasties across Europe, Asia, and the Middle East have risen and fallen, the Japanese imperial house has remained unbroken, its rituals performed without interruption, its lineage preserved through centuries of change. This continuity has attracted both admiration and curiosity, symbolizing Japan's ability to balance tradition and adaptation. In a world where modern nations often struggle to reconcile ancient heritage with contemporary demands, Japan's imperial lineage stands as a reminder that continuity can be a source of resilience rather than stagnation. The Yamato legacy thus contributes not only to Japanese identity, but to the broader understanding of how cultures can endure across millennia. The enduring significance of the Yamato lineage lies in its ability to embody both change and continuity. It has been divine ruler and symbolic figurehead, cultural patron and national symbol, active sovereign and passive emblem. It has presided over the flowering of courtly refinement, the rise of warrior governments, the modernization of the Meiji era, and the democratic reconstruction of the post-war period. In each phase, it has adapted to the demands of the moment while preserving the core identity of descent from Amaterasu and the performance of sacred ritual. This duality, flexibility in function, steadfastness in identity, is the essence of the Yamato legacy. Today, the emperor continues to embody this legacy. Modern enthronements, with their ancient rituals performed before audiences around the world, connect contemporary Japan to its mythic past. Ceremonies at Ise Shrine, seasonal rituals at the palace, and the emperor's symbolic role as unifier of the people demonstrate the continuity of traditions that stretch back to the earlier centuries of Japanese history. In a globalized world, where identities are often fragmented and histories contested, the Yamato lineage provides Japan with a unique anchor, a living connection to antiquity that continues to shape the present. The Yamato legacy is not a relic of the past, but a vital part of modern Japanese identity, a reminder that history, myth, and culture remain inseparable in the life of a nation. The place of the Yamato lineage in Japanese identity is thus both profound and enduring. It represents the sacred origins of the nation, the resilience of its institutions, the synthesis of its cultural influences, and the adaptability of its sovereignty. It has provided continuity through upheavals, unity through divisions, and meaning through change. The Yamato legacy is the story of a people who have preserved their identity across millennia by rooting it in a lineage that connects heaven and earth, myth and history, tradition and modernity. As long as the rituals continue and the lineage endures, the Yamato will remain at the heart of Japanese identity, a symbol of continuity in a world of change,